Hello friends. About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all. My name is Edward Taylor, and I'm 63 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened in 2010, but the memories remain as vivid and haunting as if it were yesterday. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where life was pretty uneventful. I wasn't much of a thrill seeker, more of a guy who preferred a quiet weekend with friends, maybe a couple of beers and a football game. I worked as an IT specialist, which, as you can imagine, doesn't come with a lot of excitement. In my youth, I had dreams of adventure, of seeing the world beyond the cornfields and modest skyline of Cedar Rapids. But as the years passed, those dreams faded, replaced by the comfort of routine and the security of a steady paycheck. My world became a series of familiar patterns: the hum of computer servers, the glow of monitors, and the predictable rhythm of office small talk. I had two close friends who helped break the monotony, Rafe and Simon. We'd known each other since high school, and despite our different paths in life, we'd managed to maintain a solid friendship. Rafe was the practical one, always grounded in reality. He managed a local hardware store, and his approach to life was much like his approach to home repairs: methodical, careful, and always with the right tool for the job. Simon, on the other hand, was our wild card. A freelance graphic designer with an erratic schedule and an even more erratic personality, he was always the one pushing us out of our comfort zones. His creativity wasn't limited to his work. It spilled over into every aspect of his life, from his ever-changing hairstyles to his spontaneous road trip ideas. Our getaways were usually a strange blend of Rafe's meticulous planning and Simon's impromptu adventures. More often than not, we'd end up in some small-town bar sharing stories with locals, or hiking trails that Simon swore would lead to something amazing. They rarely did, but the journey was always memorable. It was late on a Friday afternoon in early October when everything changed. I was hunched over my keyboard, eyes strained from staring at lines of code all day, when Simon burst into my office. His eyes were bright with excitement, a mischievous grin plastered across his face. "Ed, I've got our next adventure lined up," he announced, slapping a printout on my desk. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes. "Simon, I've told you 100 times I'm not going skydiving." He laughed, shaking his head. No, nothing like that. Look at this." I picked up the paper. It was a listing for a cabin rental in the Black Hills of South Dakota. The photo showed a quaint wooden structure nestled among tall pines, a small porch facing what looked like a serene forest view. "I found it online," Simon explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It's perfect, Ed. Isolated, quiet, just what we need to get away from all this." He gestured vaguely at my cluttered desk and the fluorescent-lit office beyond. I had to admit, it did look appealing. The thought of escaping the constant hum of electronics and the pressure of looming deadlines was tempting. "What does Rafe think?" I asked, knowing our practical friend would have reservations. "He's on board," Simon replied, surprising me. "I caught him at the hardware store earlier. He says it's just what we need to recharge our batteries." He mimicked Rafe's deeper voice, making me chuckle. I looked at the listing again. The cabin was indeed isolated, set deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. It promised a quiet retreat with basic amenities like electricity and running water, but no internet or cell service. A true escape from the modern world. "All right," I said finally, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Let's do it." Simon whooped, clapping me on the back. "That's the spirit, Ed. We leave tomorrow morning. I'll pick you up at 6 a.m. sharp." As he bounded out of my office, leaving behind a wake of curious stares from my coworkers, I couldn't help but smile. Despite my usual reservations about Simon's ideas, I felt a spark of excitement. Little did I know that this trip would change everything. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of fall day that makes you glad to be alive. I was up before my alarm, stuffing last-minute items into my duffel bag when I heard the honk of Rafe's SUV outside. I grabbed my gear and headed out, locking up my small house behind me. Rafe was behind the wheel, looking alert despite the early hour. Simon was sprawled in the back seat, nursing a large travel mug of coffee. "Morning, Ed," Rafe called out. "Ready for our big adventure?" I tossed my bag in the back and climbed into the passenger seat. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, accepting the thermos of coffee Rafe handed me. The drive to South Dakota was long but pleasant. We took turns at the wheel, stopping only for gas and quick meals at roadside diners. Simon regaled us with increasingly outlandish theories about what we might find in the Black Hills, each more unlikely than the last. "I'm telling you," he insisted as we crossed into South Dakota, "the place is crawling with cryptids, Bigfoot, skinwalkers, you name it." Rafe rolled his eyes. "The only creature we're likely to encounter is the infamous Black Hills squirrel, known for its ability to steal your sandwich when you're not looking." I chuckled at their banter, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The further we got from Cedar Rapids, the more the weight of my daily responsibilities seemed to lift from my shoulders. As we drove deeper into the Black Hills, the scenery changed dramatically. The flat farmlands gave way to rolling hills covered in dense forest. Massive rock formations jutted out from the trees, their gray faces stark against the vibrant fall colors of the foliage. We arrived at the cabin just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the small clearing where it stood. It was exactly as the photo had shown, a cozy wooden structure with a small porch, surrounded on all sides by towering pines. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. "Home sweet home," Simon declared, bounding up the steps to the porch. He fiddled with the lockbox, retrieving the key, and swung the door open with a flourish. The interior of the cabin was rustic but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a well-worn couch and a couple of armchairs arranged around it. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, while two doors led off to what I assumed were bedrooms. We unpacked quickly, stowing our gear and the supplies we'd brought. Rafe took charge of the kitchen, whipping up a simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce. We ate around the rough-hewn wooden table, trading jokes and planning our activities for the next few days. As night fell, the forest around us came alive with sounds: the hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the creaking of tree branches in the light breeze. It was both peaceful and slightly unnerving, so different from the constant background noise of the city. We ended the evening with a game of poker, Simon predictably losing most of his money to Rafe's careful play. I begged off early, feeling the fatigue of the long drive catching up with me. As I lay in the small, somewhat lumpy bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest night, I felt a mix of contentment and a strange, inexplicable unease. Little did I know, it was just the beginning of the most terrifying experience of my life. The next morning I awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet conversation. I stumbled out of the bedroom to find Rafe and Simon already up, huddled over mugs at the kitchen table. "Morning, sleepyhead," Simon grinned. "We were just planning our day. Rafe and I thought we'd try our luck fishing at that lake we passed on the way in. You want to join us?" I considered for a moment, but the thought of spending hours standing in cold water didn't appeal. "I think I'll pass," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "You guys go ahead. I'll hang around here, maybe do some reading." Rafe nodded, understanding. He knew I wasn't much for outdoor activities. "All right, but don't get too comfortable. We'll drag you out exploring tomorrow." They left soon after, loaded down with fishing gear and a cooler of sandwiches and beer. I waved them off, feeling a mix of relief at having some alone time and a slight twinge of anxiety at being left alone in the unfamiliar surroundings. I settled into one of the armchairs with a book I'd brought along, losing myself in the story as the morning wore on. It wasn't until early afternoon that I started to feel off. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease, like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. I tried to focus on my book, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the hours passed. It was the sensation of being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was natural to feel a bit on edge in a new place, especially one so isolated. But no matter how I rationalized it, the feeling remained, a constant prickle at the back of my neck. Finally, unable to concentrate on my book any longer, I decided to take a walk around the property. Maybe some fresh air and movement would clear my head. I pulled on a light jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The day was overcast now, the bright morning sun hidden behind a layer of gray clouds. The woods seemed darker, more oppressive than they had the day before. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and set off along a faint path that led around the cabin. The underbrush was thick, brambles and low-hanging branches forcing me to watch my step carefully. I didn't venture far from the cabin, not wanting to risk getting lost in the unfamiliar terrain. As I walked, I tried to focus on the natural beauty around me, the intricate patterns of bark on the trees, the delicate structure of fallen leaves, the occasional flash of a bird or small animal darting through the undergrowth. But the feeling of being observed never left me. Several times I spun around, certain I'd catch sight of whatever was causing this sensation, but there was never anything there, just the silent, watchful trees. After about an hour of this, I'd had enough. The walk, far from calming me, had only heightened my anxiety. I turned back towards the cabin, walking quickly, eager to be back within its walls. As I approached the clearing, I stopped short. Something was different. It took me a moment to realize what it was, and when I did, I felt a chill run down my spine. There were footprints around the cabin that hadn't been there before. They were large, almost human-like, but with a peculiar shape. It was as if someone or something had been wearing oddly shaped boots. The prints circled the cabin, coming close to the windows and doors before leading off into the woods. I stood there, frozen, staring at the tracks. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Could it have been Rafe and Simon playing some kind of prank? But no, I knew they were still at the lake. A local hunter, perhaps? But why would they be circling our cabin? The sense of being watched intensified, and suddenly I couldn't bear to be outside for another moment. I rushed into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding as I moved from window to window, making sure they were all securely latched. As I finished checking the last window, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just at the edge of the clearing, where the shadows of the forest were deepest, I thought I saw something. A figure, tall and oddly shaped, standing perfectly still. I blinked, and it was gone. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of heightened alertness, jumping at every creak of the cabin's old timbers, every rustle of wind through the trees outside. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that my imagination was running wild in these unfamiliar surroundings, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When Rafe and Simon finally returned, laden with a decent catch of fish and full of stories about their day, I was almost giddy with relief. I debated whether to tell them about what I'd experienced. Part of me worried they'd think I was losing it, seeing things that weren't there. But as we sat down to dinner, fresh-caught trout that Rafe had expertly prepared, I decided I had to say something. "Guys," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "something weird happened while you were gone." They both looked up, curious. I told them about the feeling of being watched, the strange footprints, and what I thought I'd seen at the edge of the clearing. As I spoke, I could see the expressions on their faces change. Rafe looked concerned, while Simon's eyes lit up with excitement. "I knew it," Simon exclaimed when I finished. "I told you this place had secrets." Rafe, ever the voice of reason, tried to calm him down. "Now hold on, let's not jump to conclusions. There could be a perfectly rational explanation for all of this." "Like what?" I asked, a bit more sharply than I intended. Rafe thought for a moment. "Well, the footprints could have been from some local hunters. Maybe they were curious about the cabin being occupied. And as for what you thought you saw, Ed, you were already on edge. It could have been a shadow or an animal." I wanted to believe him, I really did, but I couldn't shake the certainty of what I'd experienced. "Maybe," I said, unconvinced, "but what do we do now?" "I say we investigate." Simon was practically bouncing in his seat. "This is exactly the kind of adventure we came out here for." Rafe shot him a stern look. "No, absolutely not. If there is someone or something out there, the last thing we want to do is go looking for trouble." He turned to me. "Ed, I think we should just be extra cautious. We'll make sure everything's locked up tight tonight, and tomorrow we'll stick together. No one goes off alone, okay?" I nodded, feeling slightly reassured by Rafe's calm demeanor. We spent the rest of the evening trying to distract ourselves with card games and conversation. But there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Every unexpected noise from outside made us all pause, listening intently. As we prepared for bed, Rafe did a thorough check of all the doors and windows. Simon, for once, wasn't arguing about turning in early. I think we all felt safer together inside the cabin than alone in our rooms. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The events of the day kept replaying in my mind. What had I really seen out there? Was Rafe right, and it was all just my imagination running wild? Or was there something in these woods, something that didn't want us here? Eventually exhaustion won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. But my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the sensation of being hunted through endless dark forests. I awoke the next morning to the sound of hushed, urgent voices. Groggy and disoriented, it took me a moment to remember where I was. As the fog of sleep cleared, I realized the voices belonged to Rafe and Simon, and they sounded worried. I quickly got dressed and made my way to the main room of the cabin. Rafe and Simon were standing by the front door, their faces pale and drawn. They looked up as I entered, and the expressions on their faces sent a chill through me. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. Rafe took a deep breath before answering. "The back door was open when we woke up this morning, wide open." I felt my stomach drop. "But you checked all the locks last night. I saw you do it." "I know," Rafe said, running a hand through his hair. "I triple-checked everything. There's no way it should have been open." Simon, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. "That's not all. There are more of those footprints you saw yesterday, all around the cabin. And—" He hesitated, glancing at Rafe before continuing. "There are scratch marks on the back door, deep ones." I moved to the back door to see for myself. Sure enough, there were long, jagged gouges in the wood, as if something with immense strength had tried to claw its way in. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the splintered wood. A shudder ran through me as I imagined what kind of creature could have made these. "We need to leave," I said, turning back to my friends. "Now!" But Rafe shook his head. "We can't. I went to start the car, but it won't turn over. Something's wrong with the engine." "What?" I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. "Did you check under the hood?" "Yeah," Rafe replied, his voice tight with tension. "It looks like something's been chewing on the wires. A lot of them are frayed or completely severed." Simon, who had been pacing nervously, stopped and looked at us. "Guys, I hate to say this, but I think we're dealing with something not natural here." I wanted to argue, to find some rational explanation, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just a curious animal or some local pranksters. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Let's think this through. We're about 20 miles from the nearest town, right? Maybe we could hike out, try to get help." Rafe shook his head. "It would take us all day, and I don't like the idea of being out in those woods after dark. Plus, we don't know what's out there." "So what, we just sit here and wait for it to come back?" Simon's voice was rising, panic evident in his tone. "No," Rafe said firmly. "We prepare. We've got food and water for a few days. We'll barricade the doors and windows as best we can, and we'll take turns keeping watch." It wasn't a great plan, but it was the best we had. We spent the next few hours securing the cabin as best we could. We pushed heavy furniture in front of the doors and nailed boards over the windows, leaving just small gaps to see out. Rafe found an old axe in a woodshed behind the cabin, and we took turns sharpening it to a wicked edge. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to come alive with sounds, rustling in the underbrush, the crack of branches, and occasionally a low guttural noise that sent shivers down our spines. We huddled in the main room, taking turns watching out the windows while the others tried to rest. It was during my watch, in the darkest hours of the night, that I saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding night, moving at the edge of the clearing. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, with a strange, loping gait. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest sound would attract its attention. The creature paused, and I could have sworn it turned to look directly at the cabin. For a moment I thought I saw a flash of eyes reflecting in the dim moonlight. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest. I woke Rafe and Simon, my hands shaking as I described what I'd seen. We spent the rest of the night in tense silence, jumping at every sound from outside. The next day passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. We debated our options endlessly, but always came back to the same conclusion. We were trapped, at least until we could repair the car or risk the long hike to town. As the sun began to set on our third day at the cabin, we were all on edge. The scratching and strange noises had become more frequent, more insistent. Whatever was out there, it was getting bolder. It was Simon who suggested we try to capture evidence of the creature. If we can get a photo or video, maybe people will believe us. Maybe we can get help. Rafe and I were skeptical, but we were running out of options. We set up Simon's camera near one of the windows, ready to capture anything that might approach the cabin. As night fell, the familiar sounds began again. The rustling, the cracking branches, the low, inhuman growls. We huddled together, watching the small screen of the camera, our hearts pounding. Suddenly there was a loud thud against the side of the cabin, making us all jump. Then another and another. It sounded like something large was hurling itself against the walls. "It's trying to get in," Rafe whispered, his face pale in the dim light. The attacks on the cabin grew more frenzied. We could hear wood splintering, the barricades we'd erected groaning under the assault. Simon clutched the camera, his knuckles white as he pointed it towards the sounds. Then, with a deafening crash, one of the boarded-up windows burst inward. In the chaos of flying splinters and broken glass, we caught our first clear glimpse of the creature. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, huge and powerfully built, with long, shaggy fur covering its body. Its face was a nightmarish blend of bear and ape, with glowing yellow eyes and a mouth full of wickedly sharp teeth. Simon let out a strangled cry, the camera slipping from his grasp. The creature's head snapped towards us, its eyes locking onto our huddled forms. For a moment time seemed to stand still. Then Rafe was moving, grabbing the axe we'd prepared. With a yell that was equal parts terror and defiance, he swung the weapon at the monster. The blade connected with a sickening thud, and the creature reeled back, letting out a bone-chilling roar of pain and rage. "Run!" Rafe shouted, already backing towards the front door. "Get to the car." We didn't need to be told twice. We burst out of the cabin and into the night, the enraged howls of the creature spurring us on. I could hear it crashing through the cabin behind us, wood splintering as it forced its massive body through the door. We reached Rafe's SUV, piling in as he fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. Just as the headlights illuminated the area in front of us, we saw the creature emerge from the cabin. It charged towards us, moving with impossible speed for something so large. Rafe slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning in the loose dirt as we backed away. The monster reached us just as we started to move, its claws raking across the hood of the car with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. Rafe shifted into drive and floored the accelerator. We shot forward, the sudden movement causing the creature to lose its grip. In the rearview mirror, I could see it growing smaller as we sped away, its furious roars fading into the night. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd just experienced. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of the nearest town that Rafe finally spoke. What do we do now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Simon, still clutching his camera, looked up. "We have evidence now. We have to tell someone, warn them about what's out there." But as we sat there, the adrenaline fading and exhaustion setting in, I realized it wasn't that simple. Who would believe us? A tale of a monster in the woods, backed up by what was likely shaky, dark footage. We'd be laughed out of town, maybe even accused of causing the damage to the cabin ourselves. "No," I said finally. "We can't tell anyone. Not yet, anyway. We need time to think, to figure out what to do with what we know." Rafe and Simon looked at me, then slowly nodded. We made a pact then and there, swearing to keep our experience a secret until we could make sense of it ourselves. We drove back to Cedar Rapids in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Life gradually returned to normal, or at least a semblance of it. We went back to our jobs, our routines, but things were different now. We knew there were things out there, things that defied explanation. Months passed, and we rarely spoke of that weekend, but I know it weighed on all of us. Simon became obsessed with researching cryptids and unexplained phenomena. Rafe threw himself into his work, as if trying to lose himself in the mundane to forget the extraordinary. As for me, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the safety of my home, in the familiar streets of Cedar Rapids, I would sometimes catch a glimpse of something large and dark out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, it was always gone. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Just my imagination. But late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I remember those glowing yellow eyes, and I wonder if somewhere out there in the darkness it remembers me too. The experience in the Black Hills changed us all. It opened our eyes to a world beyond what we thought we knew, a world where the line between reality and nightmare is far more blurred than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I find myself longing for the simple life I had before, when the greatest mystery in my world was why the office printer kept jamming. But there's no going back now. Once you've seen behind the veil, you can never truly unsee it. All we can do is move forward, carrying the weight of our secret, and hope that we never again find ourselves face to face with the unknown horrors that lurk in the shadows of our world. As I sit here now, years later, recording this account, I still struggle to make sense of what happened to us in those woods. Was it real, or some shared delusion brought on by isolation and fear? The rational part of my mind wants to dismiss it, to file it away as a strange but ultimately explainable event. But then I remember the feel of those claw marks under my fingers, the sound of that unearthly roar, the blazing yellow eyes that seemed to glow with an inner fire. And I know, deep in my bones, that what we encountered was real. I don't know why I'm sharing this story now. Maybe it's a warning to others who might venture into those remote woods. Maybe it's an attempt to finally unburden myself of this secret I've carried for so long. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a call out into the darkness, a message to whatever's out there, watching and waiting. We saw you. We know you exist. And we're still here, carrying the truth of your existence with us every day. To anyone reading this, I implore you, be careful out there. The world is vast and full of wonders, yes, but it also harbors dangers beyond our comprehension. Sometimes the greatest horror isn't what we can see, but what lurks just beyond our understanding, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. As for me, Rafe, and Simon, we've made our peace with what happened. We still get together sometimes, sharing a beer and reminiscing about old times, but there's always an unspoken agreement to avoid mentioning that weekend. It's easier that way to pretend it never happened. Yet every now and then, I'll catch Simon staring off into the distance, a troubled look on his face. Or I'll notice Rafe's hand tighten on his beer bottle when a shadow passes by the window. And I know they're remembering too. We're bonded by our experience, the three of us, bound together by a truth we can never fully share with the world. It's a heavy burden to bear, but we bear it together. And so, dear reader, I leave you with this final thought. The next time you find yourself alone in the woods, and the hairs on the back of your neck stand up for no apparent reason, pay attention. Listen to that primal instinct that tells you something's not right, because sometimes, just sometimes, there really is something out there in the darkness, and it's watching you. It was the summer of 1987, and the monotony of my life as a mechanic in Roanoke, Virginia, was slowly suffocating me. Every day I'd wake up at the crack of dawn, drag myself to the same garage I'd been working at for the past decade, and spend my hours elbow-deep in grease and motor oil. The repetitive nature of the job, coupled with the constant whir of engines and the acrid smell of gasoline, was wearing me down. My name's Lester Darrow, and I've always prided myself on being a hard worker. But even the toughest men have their breaking points, and I was rapidly approaching mine. The idea of escaping into the wilderness, if only for a few days, began to take root in my mind. The Appalachian Mountains, with their dense forests and rugged terrain, called to me like a siren song. One particularly grueling Friday, as I was finishing up a transmission repair on an old Ford pickup, I made my decision. I needed a break, and I needed it soon. The mountains were calling, and I had to answer. That evening I called up my two closest friends, Doug Miller and Steve Hawthorne. We'd known each other since high school, and despite our different paths in life, we'd remained thick as thieves. Doug was a lanky fellow who worked as a journalist for the local newspaper. He had a gift for storytelling and a penchant for embellishment that often left us in stitches. Steve, on the other hand, was a quiet, dependable type who worked as a park ranger. His knowledge of the outdoors was unparalleled, and I knew he'd be invaluable on a hiking trip. "Hey fellas," I said when we met up at our usual watering hole, O'Malley's pub, that night. "I've got an idea I want to run by you." Doug raised an eyebrow, his beer halfway to his lips. "Oh yeah? What's cooking, Lester?" I leaned in, lowering my voice despite the din of the Friday night crowd. "I'm thinking of taking a hiking trip in the Appalachians. Get away from it all for a bit, you know? Was wondering if you two might be interested in joining me." Steve nodded slowly, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "Could be good. When were you thinking?" "Next weekend," I replied. "I know it's short notice, but I've got this itch I need to scratch, you know." Doug's eyes lit up with excitement. "Count me in. I've been wanting to write a piece on the lesser-known trails in the area. This could be perfect." Steve seemed more hesitant. "I don't know, guys. The popular trails are one thing, but if we're going off the beaten path, it could be dangerous." I clapped him on the shoulder. "That's why we need you, buddy. With your outdoor skills, we'll be just fine. Besides, isn't that the whole point of an adventure? To face a little danger?" Steve sighed, but I could see the corners of his mouth twitching into a smile. All right, I'm in. But we do this my way, got it? No unnecessary risks." We spent the rest of the evening planning our trip, the excitement building with each passing minute. Doug regaled us with tales of hikers who had stumbled upon hidden treasures and long-lost settlements in the depths of the Appalachian forests. Steve, ever the voice of reason, tempered our enthusiasm with practical advice about supplies and safety precautions. As the night wore on and the pub began to empty, a sense of anticipation settled over us. We were 3 men in our late 30s, each feeling the weight of our responsibilities and the passage of time. This trip represented more than just a weekend getaway. It was a chance to recapture some of the spirit of adventure that had defined our youth. Little did we know that the journey we were about to embark on would test us in ways we could never have imagined. The Appalachian Mountains held secrets darker and more terrifying than any of us could have anticipated, and our lives would never be the same again. The week leading up to our trip passed in a blur of anticipation and last-minute preparations. I threw myself into my work at the garage with renewed vigor, knowing that each oil change and brake job brought me closer to our departure date. The familiar sense of motor oil and rubber, which had seemed so oppressive before, now carried a hint of excitement. Every evening after work, I'd pore over maps of the Shenandoah National Park, tracing potential routes with my finger and imagining the sights we'd see. Steve had mentioned an old logging trail that supposedly led to a hidden waterfall, and the idea of discovering something few others had seen filled me with a childlike wonder. On Wednesday night, we met at Steve's place to go over our gear and finalize our plans. His living room looked like an outdoor equipment store had exploded, with backpacks, sleeping bags, and various tools scattered across every surface. "All right, boys," Steve said, his normally quiet demeanor replaced by an authoritative tone. "Let's go through the checklist one more time." We spent the next hour meticulously reviewing our supplies. Steve's experience as a park ranger showed in his attention to detail. He insisted on redundancies for crucial items like first aid kits and fire-starting materials. "Remember," he said, holding up a topographical map of the area, "we're going into a part of the park that's rarely visited. Cell phones won't work out there, and the terrain can be treacherous. We need to be prepared for anything." Doug, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly piped up. "Hey, did I ever tell you guys about the story I covered last year? About the hikers who went missing in that area?" Steve and I exchanged glances. "No," I said cautiously. "What happened?" Doug's eyes gleamed with the excitement of a born storyteller. "Well, this group of college kids decided to go camping in a remote part of the park. They were experienced hikers, had all the right gear, but they never came back." "They probably just got lost," Steve interjected. "It happens more often than you'd think, even to experienced hikers." Doug shook his head. "That's the thing. When the search parties went out, they found the group's campsite. Everything was still there. Tents, supplies, even their phones. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm summer evening. "Did they ever find them?" "Nope," Doug replied, a hint of relish in his voice. "To this day, no one knows what happened to them. Some folks in the area talk about strange noises in the woods, shadows moving where they shouldn't be. They say those mountains are haunted." Steve rolled his eyes. "Come on, Doug. Don't start with that nonsense. We're here to prepare, not to scare ourselves with campfire stories. But as we continued our preparations, I couldn't shake the unease that Doug's story had planted in my mind. The logical part of me knew it was probably just sensationalized journalism, the kind of story that sold papers but had little basis in fact. Yet as I looked at the map of the vast, untamed wilderness we were about to enter, I couldn't help but wonder what secrets those ancient mountains might be hiding. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind raced with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The trip I had so eagerly anticipated now seemed to carry an undercurrent of potential danger. But isn't that what I wanted, I asked myself, to break free from the monotony, to feel truly alive again? I pushed the doubts aside and focused on the adventure ahead. In just 2 days we would be setting out into the wilderness, leaving behind the comforts and constraints of civilization. Whatever awaited us in those mountains, I was determined to face it head-on. Little did I know that the true horrors we would encounter were beyond anything we could have prepared for. The Appalachian Mountains, ancient and inscrutable, were about to reveal a darkness that would change us forever. Friday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for the start of our adventure. I woke before my alarm, a mixture of excitement and nervous energy coursing through my veins. After a quick shower and a hearty breakfast, I double-checked my backpack one last time before heading out to meet Doug and Steve. We had agreed to meet at the trailhead, a small parking area at the edge of Shenandoah National Park. As I pulled up in my battered pickup truck, I saw Steve's Jeep already there, with Doug's sedan parked beside it. The two of them were leaning against Steve's vehicle, deep in conversation. "Morning, fellas," I called out as I climbed out of my truck. "Ready for this?" Doug grinned, his enthusiasm infectious. "Born ready, Lester. Can't wait to see what's out there." Steve nodded, his expression more reserved. "Weather report looks good for the next few days. Should be perfect hiking conditions." We spent a few minutes adjusting our backpacks and going over our route one last time. The plan was to hike for about 4 hours to reach our first campsite, then push deeper into the wilderness over the next 2 days. The old logging trail that would supposedly lead us to the hidden waterfall was marked on Steve's map with a dotted line, indicating its uncertain nature. As we set off down the trail, the morning sun filtering through the canopy of leaves above us, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wild herbs. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath our boots and the occasional call of a bird high in the trees. For the first few hours, our hike was everything I had hoped it would be. We fell into an easy rhythm, with Steve leading the way, his keen eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead. Doug kept up a steady stream of chatter, telling us about his latest articles and the office gossip at the newspaper. I found myself relaxing, the stresses of my daily life falling away with each step we took deeper into the forest. As midday approached, we stopped for a quick lunch in a small clearing. The sun was high overhead, casting dappled shadows through the leaves. As we sat on fallen logs, munching on energy bars and dried fruit, Doug pulled out his notebook. "You know," he said, scribbling something down, "I've been thinking about that story I told you guys the other night, about the missing hikers." I saw Steve tense slightly. "Doug, we talked about this. No ghost stories, remember?" Doug held up his hands in a placating gesture. No, hear me out. I've been doing some digging, and it turns out there's been a surprising number of disappearances in this area over the years, more than you'd expect for a national park." Despite myself, I found my interest piqued. "What do you mean?" "Well," Doug continued, flipping through his notes, "in the past 50 years there have been at least a dozen cases of hikers going missing without a trace, and that's just the officially reported ones. Local folklore talks about people vanishing in these woods going back centuries." Steve shook his head. "That's not unusual for a wilderness area this size. People underestimate the dangers, get lost, or have accidents. It doesn't mean anything supernatural is going on." "I'm not saying it's supernatural," Doug protested. "But don't you think it's odd? Some of these people were experienced outdoorsmen like us, and in many cases they were never found. No bodies, no trace at all." A chill ran down my spine, despite the warm day. I found myself glancing at the dense forest surrounding our clearing, suddenly aware of how isolated we were. Steve stood up abruptly. All right, that's enough of that. We should get moving if we want to reach the campsite before dark. As we packed up and continued our hike, I couldn't shake the unease that Doug's words had stirred up. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just hours before, now felt oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more pronounced. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I tried to rationalize my fears. We were 3 capable men, well prepared and led by someone with extensive outdoor experience. What could possibly happen? But as the day wore on and we ventured further from the marked trails, I couldn't escape the feeling that we were being watched. More than once I caught myself peering into the underbrush, convinced I had seen something move just at the edge of my vision. Each time there was nothing there, but the sensation of unseen eyes upon us persisted. As the light began to fade and we approached our planned campsite, a sense of relief washed over me. We had made it through the first day without incident. Surely, I thought, a good night's rest would dispel these irrational fears. Little did I know that the true horrors of our journey were only just beginning. The Appalachian Mountains, ancient and inscrutable, were about to reveal secrets that would shatter our understanding of the world and test the very limits of our sanity. We reached our campsite just as the last rays of sunlight were fading from the sky. It was a small clearing near a bubbling creek, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks. Under normal circumstances, it would have been idyllic. But as we set about making camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been growing throughout the day. Steve, ever the practical one, took charge of setting up the tents while Doug and I gathered firewood. As I ventured a short distance into the surrounding forest, the darkness seemed to close in around me. The trees, which had looked so majestic in the daylight, now loomed ominously, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. "Hey, Lester!" Doug's voice made me jump. He was a few yards away, arms full of branches. "You okay, man? You look a little spooked." I forced a laugh, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Yeah, just tired, I guess. This old body isn't used to so much hiking anymore." Doug nodded sympathetically, but I could see the concern in his eyes. As we made our way back to the clearing, I resolved to pull myself together. I was being ridiculous letting Doug's stories get to me like this. Back at the campsite, Steve had a small fire going. The warm glow pushed back the encroaching darkness, and I felt some of my tension ease. We sat around the fire, cooking a simple meal of dehydrated camping food and sharing a bottle of whiskey Doug had smuggled in his pack. As we ate, Doug regaled us with more of his newspaper stories, carefully avoiding any mention of missing hikers or local legends. Steve chimed in with tales from his work as a park ranger, mostly humorous anecdotes about unprepared tourists and wildlife encounters. For a while, it felt like any other camping trip we'd taken in our younger days. But as the night wore on and the fire burned low, a heavy silence fell over our camp. The forest around us seemed to press in closer, the darkness beyond our small circle of light absolute and impenetrable. The only sound was the soft burbling of the nearby creek and the occasional pop from the dying embers. "Well," Steve said, breaking the silence, "we should probably turn in. Got another long day of hiking ahead of us tomorrow." As we prepared for bed, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. Inside my tent, I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch underfoot sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just normal forest sounds, animals going about their nightly business. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching and waiting. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound. It was a low, rumbling noise, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the ground and setting my teeth on edge. Scrambling out of my sleeping bag, I unzipped the tent and peered out into the night. The fire had died completely, leaving only the faint glow of embers. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw Doug and Steve emerging from their tents as well, looking as confused and frightened as I felt. "What the hell was that?" Doug whispered, his voice tight with fear. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again. It was closer this time, a deep guttural sound that seemed to reverberate through the very earth beneath our feet. It wasn't the roar of a bear or the howl of a wolf. This was something altogether different, something primal and terrifying. "Get the flashlights," Steve hissed, his ranger training kicking in despite the fear evident in his voice. We scrambled to comply, fumbling in the darkness for our packs. As the beams of our flashlights cut through the night, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The trees at the edge of our clearing seemed to shift and move, as if the forest itself was alive and restless. "There," Doug gasped, his flashlight beam fixed on a point just beyond the tree line. For a split second I saw it, a massive, shadowy form, hunched and misshapen. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, more like smoke than a solid creature. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, leaving us to question whether we had really seen anything at all. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Steve shook his head, his face pale in the harsh glare of the flashlights. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it in all my years as a ranger." We stood there, huddled together in the center of the clearing, our flashlights scanning the surrounding forest. The oppressive silence had returned, broken only by our ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Steve spoke again. We should try to get some sleep. We'll head back to the trailhead first thing in the morning." Doug and I nodded numbly, too shaken to argue. But as we retreated to our tents, I knew sleep would be impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I lay there, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, straining my ears for any sound of the creature's return. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the trees, I emerged from my tent to find Doug and Steve already up, their faces haggard and drawn. "Did either of you sleep?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. They both shook their heads. Steve was methodically packing up his gear, his movements mechanical and precise. Doug, on the other hand, was scribbling furiously in his notebook, his eyes wild and unfocused. "We need to leave," Steve said, his voice flat. "Now." As we hurriedly broke camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just yesterday, now felt malevolent and alien. Every shadow held the potential for danger. Every unexpected sound made us freeze in terror. We set off down the trail at a brisk pace, Steve leading the way with a determined stride. But as we hiked, it quickly became apparent that something was wrong. The trail, which had been clear and well-defined yesterday, now seemed to twist and turn in unfamiliar ways. "This isn't right," Steve muttered, consulting his map for the 100th time. "We should have reached that ridge by now." Doug, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Guys, I don't think we're alone out here." I turned to look at him, ready to dismiss his words as paranoia, but the expression on his face stopped me cold. He was staring off into the forest, his eyes wide with terror. "There's something out there," he whispered. "Something watching us. Can't you feel it?" And the thing was, I could. There was a palpable sense of wrongness in the air, a feeling that we had stumbled into a place where we didn't belong. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The very air felt thick and oppressive, as if the forest itself was trying to smother us. "We need to keep moving," Steve said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The trailhead can't be far now." But as we pushed on, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. It was as if the forest was actively working against us, obscuring our path and leading us in circles. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, but we seemed no closer to finding our way out. As afternoon wore on, we found ourselves in a small clearing. It looked disturbingly familiar, and with a sinking feeling in my stomach, I realized why. "This is where we camped last night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The realization hit us all like a physical blow. We had been walking all day, and somehow we had ended up right back where we started. It was impossible, and yet here we were. "This can't be happening," Doug muttered, running his hands through his hair. "It's not possible." Steve, always the voice of reason, tried to rally us. "Okay, let's think this through. We must have gotten turned around somewhere, if we just backtrack." His words were cut off by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the same deep, rumbling noise we had heard the night before, but this time it was much closer, and it was coming from all around us. As we stood there, frozen in terror, the trees at the edge of the clearing began to move, not swaying in the wind, but actually shifting and twisting, their trunks bending in ways that defied nature. And from between them emerged a shape that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was massive, easily twice the size of a bear, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, jointed in impossible ways, and its body seemed to shift and change as it moved, as if it couldn't decide on a single form. But it was the face that truly terrified me, a twisted parody of something almost human, with too many eyes and a mouthful of needle-sharp teeth. For a moment that stretched into eternity. We stood there, face to face with something that should not exist. Then, as if a spell had been broken, we ran. We crashed through the underbrush, all thoughts of following the trail forgotten in our blind panic. Branches whipped at our faces, roots seemed to reach up to trip us, but we kept running. The creature's roar echoed through the forest behind us, spurring us on with terror-fueled energy. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish chase, but eventually, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line and onto a paved road. A park ranger's truck was parked nearby, and we collapsed in front of it, gasping for air and trembling with exhaustion and fear. The ranger who found us was skeptical of our story, of course. Who wouldn't be? We must have looked like madmen, with our wild eyes and babbling about monsters in the woods. But he couldn't deny the genuine terror he saw in our faces, or the inexplicable scratches and bruises that covered our bodies. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened to us in those mountains. Doug threw himself into research, unearthing old legends and folklore about the area. Steve quit his job as a park ranger, unable to face the wilderness he had once loved. And me? I found myself unable to sleep, haunted by nightmares of twisted trees and that horrifying, ever-changing face. We never spoke publicly about what we experienced. Who would believe us? But we knew the truth, that there are places in this world where reality is thin, where ancient and unknowable things still lurk in the shadows. And somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains, in a forest that defies the laws of nature, something is waiting, watching, hungry for its next victims. My name is Charles Williams, and at 58 years old, I've spent more of my life among trees than people. For as long as I can remember, I've been working as a park ranger in the remote wilderness of the Ouachita Mountains. It's not a job that most would consider glamorous, but for me, it's been a calling. The quiet solitude, the connection to nature, and the sense of purpose it gives me, these are things I've cherished for decades. It's difficult to explain the allure of spending days alone in the dense forest to those who haven't experienced it. The towering pines that scratch the sky, their needles rustling in the wind like whispered secrets. The occasional snapping of twigs underfoot, hinting at unseen creatures going about their daily routines. The sweet, earthy scent of decaying leaves mingling with the sharp tang of pine sap. Some might call this existence lonely, but I've always called it peaceful. I wasn't always this way, though. Before I took up the ranger's badge, I was an environmental scientist, spending my days in sterile laboratories analyzing soil samples and poring over water quality reports. I was passionate about my work, believing that through science we could understand and protect our natural world. But I was far removed from the very environment I was supposed to be safeguarding. It wasn't until tragedy struck that I realized how disconnected I'd become. My younger brother David was killed in a hit-and-run accident. He was only 32, full of life and dreams. We'd always been close, sharing a love for the outdoors that stemmed from childhood camping trips with our parents. His death hit me hard, leaving a void that the artificial world of fluorescent lights and climate-controlled corridors couldn't fill. In the wake of his loss, I found myself suffocating in the city. The constant noise, the endless sea of concrete, the frantic pace of urban life, it all felt meaningless. I needed to escape, to find some semblance of the connection I'd lost. That's when I remembered the Ouachitas. David and I had hiked there once, years ago. I could still recall the way his eyes lit up as we stood atop a ridge, gazing out over the endless expanse of green. "This is living, Charlie," he'd said, breathing in the crisp mountain air. "This is what it's all about." So I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I packed up my belongings, said goodbye to my colleagues, and moved to the Ouachitas. I never looked back. The transition wasn't easy. Trading in my lab coat for a ranger's uniform, swapping data analysis for trail maintenance, it was a world apart from what I'd known. But with each passing day, as I learned to read the forest like a book, I felt more alive than I had in years. The Ouachita National Forest is a vast expanse of wilderness, covering over 1.8 million acres across Arkansas and Oklahoma. It's a place of rugged beauty, where mountain ridges run east to west, unlike most of the nation's north-south ranges. The forest here is thick, nearly impenetrable in places. Shortleaf pines dominate the landscape, their straight trunks reaching skyward, interspersed with a variety of hardwoods, oak, hickory, and maple. In spring, the forest floor erupts in a riot of color as wildflowers bloom, trilliums, lady slippers, and wild azaleas painting the woods in hues of white, pink, and purple. Summer brings a dense canopy of green, providing shelter for countless species of birds, from the melodious wood thrush to the striking pileated woodpecker. Fall transforms the forest into a breathtaking tapestry of reds, oranges, and golds as the leaves change. And in winter, when the deciduous trees stand bare, the evergreen pines provide a reminder of the forest's enduring life. My job as a ranger was multifaceted. I kept the trails somewhat navigable, though nature seemed to have other ideas. Branches and roots constantly reclaimed the paths, as if the forest itself was trying to erase human presence. I assisted the occasional lost hiker, taught them to read maps and use compasses, and sometimes just listened to their stories around a campfire. But most importantly, I made sure the wildlife stayed as undisturbed as possible. It was simple work, or so it seemed at first. Wake up at dawn, patrol my assigned area, maintain trails, check in with any registered campers, and keep an eye out for signs of trouble, whether from human visitors or natural causes like wildfires or diseased trees. I'd return to my cabin as the sun set, write up my daily report, and fall asleep to the sound of crickets and distant owl hoots. But there was one aspect of my job that I never quite got used to, the search and rescue operations. For a place so seldom visited, there were more missing persons cases than you'd expect. Folks would come to hike or camp, drawn by the promise of pristine wilderness and the opportunity to disconnect from the modern world. And then sometimes, they just wouldn't come back. The local police would call me in as the expert, and we'd mount search parties. We'd find their tents, their gear, sometimes even their food still hanging in trees to keep it away from bears. But no people, no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away, nothing. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed them whole. The last time we found something was a month ago. A family from Little Rock had come up for a weekend camping trip, a husband, wife, and 2 kids. They were seasoned campers, knew the area well. On the 3rd day, the husband called the local sheriff's office, frantic, saying his wife and children had gone to collect firewood and hadn't returned. We searched for days. I led teams through every inch of the surrounding area, combed through underbrush, rappelled down cliffs, and waded through streams. In the end, all we found was a small pile of wood near their campsite, neatly stacked as if they'd just set it down and walked away. The husband couldn't explain it. "They knew these woods," he kept saying, his voice hoarse from calling their names. "They wouldn't have gotten lost. They wouldn't have left without telling me." I watched as the light in his eyes dimmed with each passing day, hope giving way to a hollow despair that I'd seen too many times before. When we finally had to call off the search, he looked at me with empty eyes and asked, "What's out there, Ranger? What's taking them?" I didn't have an answer for him. I wish I did. I wish I could have told him that they'd turn up, that there was a rational explanation for all of this. But deep down, I knew better. Because even after all these years in these woods, there were things I couldn't explain, things that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, that made me question everything I thought I knew about nature and the world around us. But that's not what this story is about. This is about the day everything changed. The day I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that shattered my understanding of reality and left me questioning my sanity. This is about the day I discovered what was really hiding in the Ouachita Mountains. It was a crisp autumn morning when it all began. The kind of day that makes you glad to be alive, with a sky so blue it hurt to look at and air so clean it felt like your first real breath. I'd set out at dawn for a routine patrol of the northernmost edge of the park, an area few people ventured into due to its rough terrain and lack of established trails. I've always liked it up there. The trees grow denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral. The air is cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. A stream runs through the rocks, creating little waterfalls and pools that reflect the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. It's the kind of place that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. As I hiked, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease that had been growing over the past few weeks. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a sense that something was off. The birds seemed quieter, the undergrowth more still. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the forest was holding its breath. I'd been walking for a few hours, making mental notes of areas that needed attention, a fallen tree blocking a game trail, signs of erosion near the stream, when I noticed something odd. There was a strange smell in the air, musty and rank, like rotting leaves mixed with wet fur. It wasn't a smell I recognized, and after years out here I prided myself on knowing every scent of the forest. Curiosity piqued, I decided to investigate. I followed the odor, figuring it was probably a dead animal, maybe a deer that had gotten caught in a rock slide or fallen prey to a mountain lion. As I got closer, the smell grew stronger, almost overpowering. I had to cover my mouth and nose with my shirt just to keep from gagging. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was just a fallen tree, one of those massive oaks that had finally given way to age and gravity. But as I approached, I realized it was something else entirely. The ground around the base of the tree was torn up, like something had clawed at it with great force, and in the center of this disturbed earth was a massive, gaping hole. Now, I've seen sinkholes before. They're not common in the Ouachitas, but they do happen. But this wasn't natural. The edges of the hole were too clean, too precise, as if something had been digging with purpose. The exposed roots of nearby trees hung down into the darkness, like gnarled fingers reaching for something below. I crouched down, shining my flashlight into the darkness below, but the beam was swallowed up after just a few feet. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. It reminded me of the time I'd stumbled upon a bear's den, that same musky animal scent, but mixed with something else, something that made my instincts scream danger. I should have called it in right then and there. That would have been the sensible thing to do, the thing any rational person would have done. But I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was a misplaced sense of duty, or maybe it was something else, something calling to me from that darkness. I grabbed the rope from my pack, testing its strength before tying it to the nearest sturdy tree. Then, with a deep breath that I immediately regretted due to the stench, I began to lower myself into the hole. It was narrow at first, just wide enough for my shoulders. The walls were damp, covered in a slick film that made me grateful for the rope. After about 10 feet, the shaft suddenly opened up into a cavern. I swung my flashlight around, trying to get my bearings. The space was vast, far larger than I would have expected. The walls were smooth, unnaturally so, as if they'd been polished by something over countless years. Here and there I could see strange markings, not graffiti or cave paintings, but something more organic, like the patterns you might see on a seashell or a tree's growth rings. As I descended further, the air grew thicker, heavier. It was hard to breathe, and not just because of the smell. It felt like the very atmosphere was pressing down on me, as if the weight of the earth above was trying to squeeze me out of existence. Every muscle in my body was tensed, every sense on high alert. I'd faced down my fair share of dangerous situations in these woods, cornered bears, flash floods, even the occasional armed poacher. But this was different. For the first time in years, I felt like prey. When my feet finally touched the ground, I nearly lost my balance. The floor was uneven, covered in what felt like small, round objects. I swung my flashlight down and felt my blood run cold. Bones, Dozens, maybe hundreds of them scattered across the cavern floor. Some were old, brittle, turned yellow with age. Others were disturbingly fresh, still with bits of flesh clinging to them. I recognized deer antlers, rabbit skulls, even what looked like the massive paw of a bear. But mixed in among them, unmistakable in their shape and size, were human bones. I saw a small skull, no bigger than my fist, and felt bile rise in my throat. A child. Some of these bones belonged to a child. That's when I heard it, a scraping sound like claws on stone echoing from deeper within the cavern. My flashlight flickered, the beam weakening as if something was draining its power. I swung it in the direction of the noise, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the darkness. A shadow darker than the blackness around it, shifting and coiling like living smoke. I've spent my entire adult life in these woods. I know every animal, every plant, every natural phenomenon that occurs here. But in that moment, faced with whatever was lurking in the depths of that cavern, I realized how little I truly understood about the world. The scraping grew louder, closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to climb back up that rope and never look back. But I was frozen, transfixed by the approaching darkness. And then I saw it. The creature that emerged from the shadows was unlike anything I'd ever seen, unlike anything that should exist in this or any world. It stood on 4 legs, its body covered in thick matted fur that was black and wet, like it had just crawled out of a swamp. Its back was arched, long and sinewy, with muscles rippling beneath the skin in ways that defied natural anatomy. But it was the head that seared itself into my memory, the image that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was shaped vaguely like a wolf's, but grotesquely elongated. The snout was too long, the jaw too wide, stretching nearly to where ears should have been, and the teeth, row upon row of serrated fangs, each as long as my finger, dripping with a thick dark fluid that sizzled when it hit the cave floor. Its eyes, though, God, its eyes. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen on a living creature. They were empty, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light, leaving nothing behind. Looking into them, I felt a cold that went beyond physical sensation, a primal terror that reached into the depths of my soul. I faced down predators before, bears, coyotes, even a mountain lion once. But this thing was different. It wasn't just a hunter. It was hunger personified, a being of pure, insatiable appetite. And right now, its attention was fixed squarely on me. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We stared at each other. Me, a speck of life in a sea of bones, and it, an abomination that should not be. Then, with a sound that was part growl, part scream, it lunged. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. Survival instinct kicked in, overriding the paralysis of fear. I ran, my boots slipping on the slick stone and bones as I scrambled back toward the rope. The creature was fast, impossibly so for its size. I could feel its hot, fetid breath on the back of my neck as its jaws snapped inches from my leg. In desperation, I swung my flashlight backward, not even looking as I aimed for where I thought its face would be. There was a sickening crunch, followed by a howl of pain and rage that shook the very walls of the cavern. The sound disoriented me, setting my ears ringing, but it had bought me precious seconds. I grabbed the rope and hauled myself up with strength born of pure terror. Below me I could hear the creature recovering, its claws scraping against stone as it prepared for another lunge. I climbed faster than I ever had in my life, my arms burning, my lungs screaming for air. The shaft seemed to go on forever, the circle of daylight above barely growing larger no matter how much I climbed. I could hear the thing below me, snarling and snapping, the sound echoing up the tunnel and surrounding me. Several times I felt claws graze my boots, tearing through the thick leather like it was paper. When I finally reached the top, I didn't stop. I scrambled out of the hole, still clutching the rope, and ran. I ran until my legs gave out, until I couldn't breathe, until the forest around me looked familiar again. Only then did I allow myself to collapse, gasping for air, my entire body shaking with exhaustion and residual fear. As I lay there on the forest floor, leaves sticking to my sweat-soaked clothes, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. And yet the torn shreds of my boots and the lingering stench clinging to my clothes told me otherwise. I don't know how long I stayed there. but eventually I managed to pull myself together enough to stand. My ranger training kicked in, reminding me of protocols, of the need to report this. But what would I say? Who would believe me? With shaking hands, I reached for my radio. It took me 3 tries to press the call button, my fingers numb and uncooperative. When I finally managed to speak, my voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. "Base, this is Ranger Williams. I need backup. There's been an incident." The response came quickly, tinny through the small speaker. "Copy that, Williams. What's your location? What kind of incident?" I rattled off my coordinates, thankful for the GPS unit on my belt that had survived the ordeal. But when it came to describing what had happened, I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding like I'd lost my mind? There's a cave system, unmarked, signs of animal activity, possibly human remains. I need a team out here, ASAP. There was a pause on the other end. "Human remains? Are you sure?" "Just get a team out here," I said, my voice cracking, "and tell them to be careful." I switched off the radio before they could ask any more questions. I knew I should head back to the hole, secure the area, wait for backup. It was procedure. But the thought of going anywhere near that place again made my stomach churn. Instead, I found myself walking in circles, eyes darting to every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush. The forest that had been my home for so long suddenly felt alien, threatening. Every snapping twig was the creature's approach, every gust of wind its rasping breath. It took almost 2 hours for the team to reach me. By then the sun was starting to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. I saw the beams of their flashlights before I heard their voices, and for a moment blind panic gripped me. But then I heard the familiar voice of Deputy Mark Simmons calling my name, and relief washed over me like a physical force. "Over here," I called, my voice still weak. As they approached, I saw the concern on their faces. I must have looked a mess, clothes torn and dirty, face pale, eyes wild. Mark reached me first, his hand going to his holstered gun as he scanned the area. "Jesus, Charlie, what happened to you?" he asked, helping me to my feet. I hadn't even realized I'd sat down. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe what I'd seen? Instead, I just pointed in the direction of the hole. "This way," I managed, "but we need to be careful. There's something out there." Mark nodded, all business now. He'd been on enough search and rescue operations with me to know when things were serious. He signaled to the rest of the team, 2 other deputies and a paramedic, and we set off. As we walked, I tried to gather my thoughts, to find a way to warn them without sounding crazy. But every attempt died on my lips. How do you prepare someone for something you can't even explain to yourself? When we reached the clearing where the hole had been, I stopped short. The others nearly ran into me, confused by my sudden halt. The hole was gone. Where there had been a gaping maw in the earth just hours before, there was now only undisturbed forest floor. No torn-up ground, no exposed roots, nothing. "I don't understand," I muttered, stumbling forward. "It was right here. I swear it was right here." I fell to my knees, running my hands over the ground, searching for any sign of disturbance. But there was nothing. Just leaves and dirt and the occasional rock. "Charlie," Mark said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe you should sit down. Paula here can take a look at you." The paramedic stepped forward, her face a mask of professional concern. But I shrugged off Mark's hand, scrambling to my feet. "No, you don't understand. It was here, a hole at least 10 feet across, deep. There were bones, so many bones, and something else, something alive." I saw the looks they exchanged, concern, doubt, pity. They thought I was losing it. Hell, maybe I was. "Okay, Charlie," Mark said soothingly. "Why don't you tell us exactly what happened, from the beginning?" So I did. I told them everything. The smell, the hole, the cavern full of bones. I described the creature in as much detail as I could bear to recall. As I spoke, I saw their expressions change from concern to disbelief to something approaching fear. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. "That's quite a story, Charlie," he said carefully. "But you can see why we might have some trouble believing it. I mean, look around. There's no sign of any disturbance here." "I know what I saw," I insisted, but even to my own ears I sounded desperate. Mark sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "All right, here's what we're going to do. Paula's going to check you out, make sure you're okay. The rest of us will do a sweep of the area, look for any signs of, well, anything unusual. Okay?" I nodded, suddenly exhausted. As Paula led me to a fallen log to sit down, I watched the others spread out, flashlights probing the growing darkness. I wanted to tell them to be careful, to watch for any sign of movement in the shadows, but I knew it would only make me sound crazier. Paula's examination was thorough, but quick. Apart from some scrapes and bruises and a racing heartbeat she attributed to stress, I was physically fine. But I could see the questions in her eyes, the ones she was too professional to ask out loud. As she finished up, Mark and the others returned. Their faces told me everything I needed to know before Mark even opened his mouth. "We didn't find anything, Charlie," he said gently. "No hole, no cave, no creature. Are you sure you didn't hit your head or something? Maybe got turned around and fell?" I wanted to argue, to make them understand, but I was tired, so tired, and a small part of me was starting to doubt myself. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? "Maybe," I said quietly. "Maybe you're right." Mark nodded, relief evident on his face. "Okay, let's get you back to base. You can get some rest and we'll figure this all out in the morning." As they led me away, I couldn't help but look back. For just a moment I thought I saw something move in the deepening shadows, a flicker of darkness deeper than the night around it. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, as I lay in my bunk at the ranger station, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, its void-like eyes staring into my soul. I heard the scraping of its claws, smelled its fetid breath. More than once I jerked awake, certain I'd heard that unearthly howl echoing through the night. But morning came, as it always does. With the sun streaming through my window, the horrors of the previous day seemed distant, dreamlike. I almost managed to convince myself that it had all been some sort of stress-induced hallucination. Almost. Then I saw my boots, still caked with cave mud, the leather shredded at the heels. And I knew. Whatever I had seen, whatever had happened, it was real, and I had a feeling it was far from over. The next few weeks passed in a blur of debriefings, psychological evaluations, and tense silences. I was placed on administrative leave. "Just until we sort this all out," they said, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought I was cracking up, the stress of the job finally getting to me. I couldn't really blame them. If our positions were reversed, I'm not sure I would have believed me either. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. I spent my days poring over maps of the area, trying to pinpoint exactly where I had found that hole. My nights were plagued by nightmares, vivid recreations of my encounter that left me waking in a cold sweat, sheets tangled around my legs. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I stumbled upon something interesting. An old geological survey of the area, dating back to the 1930s, mentioned a network of caves that defied conventional mapping techniques. The surveyors had noted unusual magnetic disturbances in the area, and several of their team had reported feeling unsettled and watched while working there. The survey had been buried in the archives, dismissed as the product of faulty equipment and overactive imaginations. But to me, it was the first piece of evidence that I wasn't going crazy. Armed with this new information, I went to Mark. To his credit, he listened patiently as I laid out my findings, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Charlie," he said when I finished, "I want to believe you, I do. But we've been over that area with a fine-tooth comb. There's nothing there." "Then let me go back," I pleaded. "One more time. I'll show you exactly where it was." Mark hesitated, then sighed. "All right, one more search. But if we don't find anything, that's it. You need to let this go, Charlie, for your own good." The next morning, we set out at dawn. The team was smaller this time, just Mark, myself, and 2 other rangers. As we hiked, I could feel the weight of their doubt, their concern. But I was certain. I knew what I had seen. We reached the area just as the sun was climbing towards its zenith. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of leaves under our boots. "It was here," I said, pointing to a clearing that looked like a dozen others we'd passed. "The hole was right here." Mark nodded, but I could see he didn't believe me. "All right, let's spread out. Look for anything unusual, disturbed earth, strange tracks, anything." We searched for hours. Every rock was overturned, every patch of ground examined, but there was nothing. No hole, no cave, no bones, not even the rope I had left behind in my panicked flight. As the sun began to set, Mark called an end to the search. I could see the mixture of relief and pity on his face. He thought this would be the end of it, that I'd finally accept that I had imagined it all. But as we turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flash of white among the brown leaves. I bent down to examine it and felt my breath catch in my throat. It was a bone, small, possibly from a finger or toe, and it was unmistakably human. "Mark," I called, my voice shaking, "over here." He came running, the others close behind. When he saw what I was holding, his face went pale. "Jesus," he breathed. "Is that—" I nodded. "Human and fresh." That single bone changed everything. Suddenly my story didn't seem so unbelievable. Mark called it in, and within hours the area was swarming with forensic teams and additional search parties. Over the next few days, more bones were found. Not many, and all small, phalanges, teeth, one partial vertebra. But it was enough to launch a full investigation. The official story was that we had stumbled upon a dumping ground for a possible serial killer. The papers ran with it, dubbing the unknown perpetrator the Ouachita Butcher. Tourists canceled their trips, hikers stayed away, and an air of fear settled over the entire region. But I knew the truth. This was no human killer, and I had a sinking feeling that we had only scratched the surface of whatever was really going on in these woods. As the investigation progressed, strange things began to happen. Equipment would malfunction for no apparent reason. People reported hearing odd noises in the night, sounds that didn't belong to any known animal. More than one search team member quit, citing an overwhelming sense of dread that they couldn't shake. I threw myself into the investigation, spending every waking hour combing through old records, interviewing locals, searching for any clue that might shed light on what was happening. My obsession worried my colleagues, but I couldn't stop. I knew that something was out there, something dangerous, and I felt responsible for finding it before it could hurt anyone else. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I came across a name that would change everything. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a biologist who had been conducting research in the Ouachitas just before she disappeared 3 years ago. I remembered the case vaguely. It had caused quite a stir at the time, but like so many others, it had eventually been chalked up to misadventure in the wilderness. But now, reading through her last known communications, I felt a chill run down my spine. In her final email to her university, Dr. Chen had mentioned discovering something that will rewrite our understanding of evolution and adaptation. She described a creature that defied classification, one that seemed to possess intelligence far beyond any known animal. The email cut off mid-sentence, and Dr. Chen was never heard from again. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and dialed Mark's number. It was late, but I knew he'd want to hear this. "Mark," I said as soon as he answered, not bothering with pleasantries, "I think I've found something big." I could hear the weariness in his voice as he replied, "Charlie, it's 2 a.m. Can't this wait until morning?" "No, it can't. I think I know what we're dealing with, and I think I know why we can't find it." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. True to his word, Mark arrived at my cabin in record time. As I laid out my findings, I could see the skepticism in his eyes slowly give way to concern, and then to something approaching fear. "So you're saying," he said slowly when I finished, "that this creature might be intelligent, capable of hiding itself?" I nodded. "Not just hiding, I think it's adapting, evolving. That's why we can't find the cave system. It's not just hidden, it's moving." Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "Charlie, do you know how crazy this sounds?" "Believe me, I do," I replied. "But it's the only explanation that fits all the facts. The disappearances, the moving cave, the bone fragments we found, it all adds up." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers spread out on my desk. Finally, he looked up at me, his expression grim. "Okay," he said. "What do we do now?" I took a deep breath. "We need to go back out there, but this time we need to be prepared for anything." The next few days were a flurry of activity. We assembled a team, not just rangers and local law enforcement, but also geologists, biologists, and even a cryptozoologist that Mark managed to bring in quietly. We gathered equipment, not just the usual search and rescue gear, but also advanced imaging technology, tranquilizer guns, and even a few items that I'm pretty sure weren't strictly legal. As we prepared, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would make everything clear. But time was running out. Whatever was out there, it was getting bolder. Reports of strange sightings and unexplained noises were increasing. We had to act now. The morning of the expedition dawned clear and cold. As we gathered at the ranger station, I could feel the tension in the air. Everyone knew the stakes. Everyone understood that we might be walking into something beyond our understanding. Just before we set out, Mark pulled me aside. "Charlie," he said, his voice low, "I need to know. Are you sure about this? Really sure?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm sure, Mark. Whatever's out there, we need to find it, before it finds us." He nodded, clapping me on the shoulder. "All right then, let's go hunt a monster." As we moved into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods seemed different somehow, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. It was as if the very trees were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. We reached the area where I had first encountered the creature, just as the sun was starting to dip below the tree line. As before, there was no sign of the hole or the cave system, but this time we were prepared. The geologists set up their equipment, using ground-penetrating radar to scan the area. For hours we watched as they worked, the tension mounting with each passing minute. And then, just as I was beginning to think we had made a terrible mistake, one of them called out, "I've got something, about 50 feet down, extending. My God, it goes on for miles." We crowded around the monitor, staring at the ghostly images of a vast underground network. Tunnels twisted and turned, forming a labyrinth that defied natural geology. And there, in the center of it all, was a massive cavern, easily the size of a football field. "That's it," I breathed. "That's where I saw it." Mark turned to me, his face grim. "How do we get down there?" Before I could answer, a low rumble shook the ground beneath our feet. Trees swayed, equipment toppled, and several team members lost their balance. As quickly as it had started, the tremor subsided. "Everyone okay?" Mark called out. A chorus of affirmatives answered him. I was about to suggest we regroup when I heard it, a sound that haunted my nightmares, a scraping, slithering noise like something massive moving through the earth. "Get back!" I yelled, just as the ground in front of us erupted. Earth and rocks flew into the air as a gaping maw opened before us. It was the hole. My hole, but larger now, large enough to swallow a car. And from its depths came that fetid, musty smell I remembered all too well. For a moment, everyone stood frozen in shock. Then chaos erupted. People scrambled backward, shouting and tripping over each other in their haste to get away. But I stood my ground, transfixed by what I saw emerging from the hole. It was the creature, but not as I remembered it. It had grown, its body now easily the size of an elephant. Its fur was patchy, revealing glistening scale-like skin underneath. And its face, God, its face had changed. The wolf-like features were still there, but distorted, as if it was mid-transformation into something else entirely. As it hauled itself out of the hole, I saw others behind it. Smaller versions, each unique in its horrific appearance, a whole pack of impossible creatures, born from the depths of the earth. "Charlie, run!" Mark's voice snapped me out of my trance. He was at my side, his gun drawn but shaking in his hand. The creature's void-like eyes fixed on us, and I saw something there I hadn't before. Intelligence. Not just animal cunning, but a cold, calculating awareness that chilled me to my core. It opened its mouth, and I braced myself for that bone-chilling howl. But what came out instead froze the blood in my veins. "You should not have come back." The words were guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but they were undeniably words. Mark's gun clattered to the ground. It can talk. Run, I whispered, grabbing his arm. Run! We turned and fled, the sound of pursuit close behind us. Trees whipped past, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. I could hear screams in the distance, the rest of our team scattered and terrified. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing, collapsing against a fallen log. What was that thing? Mark gasped between breaths. I shook my head, still trying to process what I'd seen. I don't know, but it's evolved, changed, and I think it's still changing. A twig snapped nearby and we both tensed. But it was Dr. Abernathy, the cryptozoologist, who stumbled into the clearing. His glasses were gone, his clothes torn, but he was alive. Fascinating, he wheezed, leaning against a tree. Simply fascinating. Do you realize what we've discovered? A nightmare, Mark muttered. But Abernathy shook his head, eyes gleaming with a fervor that bordered on madness. No, don't you see? It's evolution in action, rapid, directed evolution. These creatures, they're adapting to our presence, learning from us. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered Dr. Chen's last email. But how is that possible? Abernathy opened his mouth to respond, but his words were drowned out by an earth-shaking roar. The ground trembled beneath us, and in the distance we saw trees toppling. We need to get out of here, I said, pulling myself to my feet. We need to warn people. Mark nodded, his face pale. But how? Who would believe us? As if in answer, a chorus of howls split the air, not just from one direction, but from all around us. The pack was spreading out, surrounding us. In that moment, I realized the true scope of what we were facing. This wasn't just about one creature or even a pack of them. This was about the future of our world. These beings, whatever they were, represented a shift in the natural order, and we were woefully unprepared to deal with them. We record everything, I said, pulling out my phone. We document what we've seen, and we get that information to someone who can help. As I spoke, I hit record, pointing the camera at my face. My name is Charles Williams. I'm a park ranger in the Ouachita National Forest. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I swear on my life that it's true. I recounted everything, my first encounter, the investigation, and what we had just witnessed. As I spoke, Mark and Abernathy added their own observations, creating a frantic but comprehensive record of our discovery. Just as I finished, another roar shook the forest, closer this time, much closer. We need to move, Mark said, helping Abernathy to his feet. I nodded, ending the recording and sending it to every contact in my phone. Then, with a silent prayer that at least some of the messages would get through, we set off into the darkening forest. The next few hours were a blur of terror and exhaustion. We ran, we hid, we doubled back on our trail. All around us we could hear the creatures moving, calling to each other in that horrible amalgamation of animal sounds and broken speech. As dawn broke, we finally stumbled out of the forest and onto the main road. A police cruiser was just pulling up, likely responding to the numerous distress calls from our team. The young deputy who stepped out looked at us with wide eyes. I can only imagine what we looked like, torn clothes, covered in dirt and blood, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. What happened to you?" he stammered. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly convey the horror of what we'd experienced? It was Mark who finally spoke. "Son," he said, his voice gravelly with fatigue, "you're going to want to call for backup, a lot of backup." In the days that followed, our story spread like wildfire. At first, we were dismissed as crazy, traumatized, or attention-seeking, but then the video evidence started to surface. Shaky footage from the team's body cams and phones showing glimpses of the creatures. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make people start asking questions. The forest was closed off, declared a restricted area by the government. Teams of scientists and military personnel poured in, vanishing into the woods for days at a time. Rumors flew about what they found, or didn't find. As for me, I never set foot in those woods again. I couldn't. The memory of those void-like eyes, that terrible intelligence, was too much to bear. I left my job, moved to the city, tried to start a new life, but at night, when the city sounds die down and the shadows grow long, I can still hear them. The scraping of claws on stone, the low, rumbling growls that form almost words. And I wonder, are they still out there, still evolving? And if they are, what will they become? I don't have those answers. I'm not sure anyone does. All I know is that the world is a stranger, more terrifying place than we ever imagined. And somewhere in the depths of the Ouachita Mountains, something is waiting, watching, learning, and one day it will be ready to emerge. The forest has always been a place of mystery and wonder, a realm where the line between reality and imagination blurs. For most, it's a sanctuary of peace and natural beauty. But for those of us in search and rescue, it's a place where nightmares can become reality. My name is Robert Smith, and I've been a search and rescue officer with the United States Forest Service for the past 15 years. At 55 years old, I've seen things that would make most people question their sanity. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that fateful day in the Lewis and Clark National Forest. This is not a tale of fiction or exaggeration. This is a true account of events that transpired over 48 harrowing hours in the wilderness of Montana. It's a story of fear, survival, and the realization that sometimes the unknown is better left undiscovered. It was a crisp autumn morning when the call came in. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar aroma that usually brought me comfort. But on that day, it carried an undercurrent of foreboding. I was sitting in my office at the Fort Benton Ranger Station, sipping my third cup of coffee and reviewing reports from the previous week's patrols. The radio crackled to life, breaking the early morning silence. "Dispatch to Ranger Smith, come in." I reached for the handset, my weathered fingers wrapping around the cold plastic. "Smith here, go ahead, dispatch." "We've got a missing hiker situation, Robert. Young male, early 20s. Last known location is the trailhead of the Highwood Baldy Trail. He's been out of contact for 3 days. I felt a knot form in my stomach. 3 days was a long time to be out of contact in these parts. Copy that. Any other details? Name's Stephen Marlowe, college student on summer break. His mother reported him missing last night when he failed to check in. She says he's an experienced hiker, but this was his first solo trek. I jotted down the information, my mind already mapping out potential search areas. All right, I'm on it. I'll round up a team and head out within the hour. Roger that. Good luck, Robert. Dispatch out. I set down the handset and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. Missing hiker cases were always tricky. The forest was vast, unforgiving, and full of hidden dangers. Even experienced hikers could find themselves in trouble if they weren't careful. I stood up, my joints creaking in protest. 15 years of trekking through rough terrain had taken its toll, but I wasn't ready to hang up my boots just yet. I grabbed my gear bag and headed out to assemble the team. As I walked through the station, I caught sight of Laura Maddox coming in. Laura was one of our best trackers, with an almost supernatural ability to read the wilderness. She was in her late 40s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Morning, Robert," she called out. "You look like you're on a mission." I filled her in on the situation as we walked. Laura's expression grew serious as she listened. "Got a bad feeling about this one," she muttered, her eyes narrowing. I'd learned over the years to trust Laura's instincts. When she had a bad feeling, it usually meant trouble. "Yeah, me too," I admitted. "But we've got a job to do. You up for it?" Laura nodded, a grim smile on her face. "Always. Let me grab my gear, and I'll meet you at the truck in 10. As I watched her hurry off, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far beyond our usual search and rescue operation. Little did I know just how right that feeling would turn out to be. The drive to the trailhead was tense and quiet. Laura sat beside me, her eyes scanning the passing landscape, while I focused on the winding forest road. The Lewis and Clark National Forest stretched out around us, a vast sea of green that seemed to swallow the horizon. We arrived at the Highwood Baldy trailhead just as the first rays of sunlight were beginning to filter through the trees. The parking area was empty save for a single vehicle, a beat-up old Subaru with a University of Montana sticker on the back window. "That must be Stephen's car," Laura said, her voice low as if she didn't want to disturb the stillness of the morning. We got out and began to gear up. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. In the distance, a bird called out, its cry echoing through the trees. I shouldered my pack, feeling the familiar weight settle onto my back. All right, let's go over the plan one more time. Laura nodded, double-checking her equipment as I spoke. We'll follow the main trail for the first few miles. According to the information from Stephen's mother, he was planning to camp near Highwood Creek. If we don't find any signs of him along the way, we'll set up a base camp there and start grid searching the surrounding area. Sounds good, Laura agreed. Any word on additional support? I shook my head. Not yet. The local sheriff's department is stretched thin with a missing child case in town. They said they'd send someone out if they could spare the manpower, but for now it's just us. Laura's lips tightened into a thin line, but she didn't comment further. We both knew the risks of a two-person search in such a vast area, but we also knew that every hour we delayed decreased Stephen's chances of survival. With a final check of our gear, we set off down the trail. The forest seemed to close in around us as we walked, the trees growing denser and the underbrush thicker. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn path and the occasional call of a bird or rustle of an unseen animal in the brush. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt different, oppressive almost. I'd been on countless searches over the years, but I'd never felt anything quite like this before. You feel that? Laura asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, glad I wasn't the only one sensing it. Yeah, it's like the whole forest is holding its breath. We pressed on, our senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, every unexpected sound causing us to pause and scan our surroundings. After about an hour of hiking, we came across our first sign of Stephen. It was a small campsite just off the main trail. A tent was set up, and a makeshift fire pit had been constructed nearby. Looks like he stopped here for the night, I said, examining the area. But something's not right. Laura was already circling the perimeter of the camp, her keen eyes taking in every detail. The tent's still up and his backpack is inside, but look at this. She pointed to a set of tracks leading away from the campsite. They were erratic, deep impressions in the soft earth that suggested someone running at full speed. He left in a hurry, Laura murmured. But why? And why leave all his gear behind? I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. Whatever had spooked Stephen enough to make him abandon his campsite and run off into the wilderness couldn't be good. We need to follow those tracks, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But be on your guard. I've got a feeling things are about to get a lot more complicated. Laura nodded grimly, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on the hunting knife at her hip. Without another word, we set off following the frantic trail left by Stephen Marlowe, unaware that we were about to step into a nightmare beyond anything we could have imagined. The forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive as we followed Stephen's trail. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled over the woods, broken only by the sound of our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. These tracks don't make any sense, Laura muttered as we pressed on. Look at the stride length and the depth of the impressions. He was running full tilt, but there's no sign of what he was running from. I nodded, my eyes scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. And he kept going for a long time. Most people would have stopped to catch their breath by now, especially in this terrain. We had been following the trail for over an hour, and the signs of Stephen's passage were becoming more erratic. At times, it seemed like he had stumbled or fallen, only to scramble back to his feet and continue his headlong flight. Suddenly, Laura held up a hand, signaling me to stop. She crouched down, examining something on the ground. When she looked up at me, her face was pale. Blood, she said simply, holding up a leaf stained with a dark, reddish-brown substance. My heart sank. The situation had just gone from bad to worse. How much? Laura shook her head. Not a lot, but enough to be concerning. Looks like he might have cut himself on something while he was running. There's more up ahead. We continued on, now moving with even greater caution. The blood trail was sporadic but consistent, leading us deeper into a part of the forest I'd never explored before. The trees here were older, their trunks gnarled and twisted into bizarre shapes. Moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and the ground was soft and spongy underfoot. "Robert," Laura called out, her voice tight with tension. "You need to see this." I made my way over to where she was standing and felt my blood run cold. There, hanging from a low branch, was a shred of fabric, unmistakably a piece of a hiking jacket. But it wasn't just torn, it looked like it had been ripped apart by something with incredible strength. "Jesus," I breathed, reaching out to touch the fabric. "What the hell could have done this?" Laura shook her head, her eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen in her before. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not natural. No animal I know of could tear through reinforced nylon like that." As if in response to her words, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the forest. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the trees and sending shivers down my spine. Laura and I exchanged a glance, both of us reaching for our weapons. I unholstered my service pistol while Laura drew her hunting knife. We stood back to back, scanning the forest around us for any sign of movement. "What's the plan?" Laura whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. "We keep going. Whatever that thing is, it might have Stephen. We can't abandon him now." Laura nodded, her grip tightening on her knife. "All right, but we move carefully. No unnecessary risks." We pressed on, following the trail of blood and torn fabric. The growling had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent our hearts racing. We were being watched. I could feel it. Something was out there, stalking us, waiting for the right moment to strike. As we pushed through a particularly dense thicket, the trees suddenly gave way to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a sight that stopped us both in our tracks. It was Stephen Marlowe, or what was left of him. His body lay sprawled on the forest floor, surrounded by a pool of darkening blood. His clothes were in tatters, and deep, vicious claw marks covered his body. But it was his face that haunted me, frozen in an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "Oh, God!" Laura choked out, turning away from the gruesome scene. I stepped forward, my training kicking in despite the horror of the situation. I needed to check for any signs of life, no matter how unlikely it seemed. But as I knelt beside Stephen's body, a twig snapped in the forest behind us. I whirled around, my gun raised, to find ourselves face to face with a nightmare made flesh. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. A massive, hunched figure with matted fur and glowing predatory eyes. Its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth, and its hands ended in long, cruel claws. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet, the creature charged. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Laura's arm and pulling her towards the densest part of the forest. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces and tearing at our clothes. Behind us I could hear the creature's thunderous footsteps and its guttural roars. The forest blurred around us as we ran, fueled by pure adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. Laura stumbled over a protruding root, and I barely managed to catch her before she fell. We couldn't afford to slow down, not with that thing right on our heels. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, smell the putrid stench of decay emanating from its maw. "There," Laura gasped, pointing ahead. Through the trees I could make out the dark mouth of a cave. It wasn't ideal, but it was our only chance. We made a desperate sprint for the opening, diving inside just as the creature's claws swiped through the air where we had been moments before. We scrambled deeper into the cave, our flashlights casting wild, dancing shadows on the rocky walls. The creature roared in frustration, too large to fit through the narrow entrance. But we knew we weren't safe yet. This was its territory, and it would be waiting for us. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, I took stock of our situation. The cave was deeper than I had initially thought, with several tunnels branching off from the main chamber. The air was damp and cold, carrying the musty scent of earth and decay. "What the hell was that thing?" Laura whispered, her voice shaking. I shook my head, still trying to process what we had seen. I don't know. Nothing in my experience even comes close to explaining it. We sat in silence for a moment, catching our breath and listening for any signs that the creature was still outside. The only sound was the steady drip of water somewhere deep in the cave system. "We need to call for backup," Laura said, reaching for her radio. I nodded, pulling out my own, but as soon as I turned it on, I was met with nothing but static. "Damn it," I muttered. "No signal down here." Laura's attempts met with the same result. We were cut off, trapped in an unknown cave system with a monster lurking outside. The gravity of our situation began to sink in. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "We need to think this through. We can't stay here forever, but we can't go back the way we came. Our best bet is to see if any of these tunnels lead to another exit." Laura nodded, her training kicking in despite the fear evident in her eyes. "Agreed, but we need to be careful. There's no telling what else might be down here." We chose a tunnel that seemed to slope upwards, hoping it might lead us back to the surface. As we made our way through the narrow passage, the beam of our flashlights revealed strange markings on the walls. They looked ancient, a mix of crude pictographs and symbols I didn't recognize. "Robert," Laura called out, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Look at this." She was pointing at a particularly large collection of markings. The centerpiece was a drawing of a creature that bore a striking resemblance to the monster we had encountered. Around it were smaller figures that I assumed represented humans, arranged in what looked like a hunting or worship scene. "This doesn't make any sense," I muttered, running my hand over the cold stone. "These markings look like they're hundreds, maybe thousands of years old, but that thing out there, it shouldn't exist." Laura shook her head, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as she examined the crude drawings. "Maybe it's always existed. Maybe we're just the latest in a long line of people to encounter it." The thought sent a chill down my spine. If this creature had been here for that long, how many other hikers, campers, or search and rescue teams had fallen victim to it over the years? How had its existence remained a secret? We pressed on, the tunnel gradually widening as we went. The air grew cooler, and I could feel a faint breeze on my face. It gave me hope that we were nearing an exit. Suddenly, Laura grabbed my arm, her grip painfully tight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I strained my ears, listening intently. At first I heard nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the distant drip of water. Then faintly, I caught it. A scraping sound like claws on stone, coming from somewhere behind us. "It's in the caves," I breathed, my heart racing. "We need to move. Now." We quickened our pace, no longer bothering with stealth. The scraping grew louder, accompanied by that same bone-chilling growl we'd heard in the forest. The creature was gaining on us. The tunnel opened up into a larger cavern, moonlight filtering in through a narrow fissure high above. It was just wide enough that we might be able to squeeze through, but it would take time to climb up to it. "There's our way out," I said, pointing to the opening. "You go first. I'll cover you." Laura hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She slung her pack off and began to climb, using the rough cavern walls as handholds. I turned to face the tunnel we just exited, my pistol drawn and ready. The growling grew louder, echoing off the cavern walls. I could see movement in the shadows of the tunnel, a massive shape lumbering towards us with terrifying speed. "Hurry!" I called to Laura, risking a glance over my shoulder. She was about halfway to the opening, moving as fast as she could on the treacherous rock face. The creature burst into the cavern with a roar that shook loose stones from the walls. In the dim moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more horrifying than I'd realized. Its body was a patchwork of fur, scales, and what looked like scar tissue. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, predatory intelligence. I fired off 2 shots, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the creature's chest, but it barely seemed to notice. It charged forward, surprisingly fast for its size. I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its slashing claws. "Laura," I shouted, "are you clear?" "Almost," came her strained reply. I scrambled to my feet, firing off another shot. This one caught the creature in the eye, and it let out a howl of pain and rage. But instead of slowing it down, the injury only seemed to enrage it further. I backed away, trying to keep its attention on me and away from Laura. My back hit the cavern wall, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had nowhere left to go. The creature loomed over me, its hot, fetid breath washing over my face. I raised my gun knowing it would do little good but unwilling to go down without a fight. Just then a rock struck the creature's head, causing it to turn with a snarl. Laura, having reached the opening, was pelting it with stones. "Hey, ugly," she shouted, "over here." The distraction was all I needed. I ducked under the creature's arm and made a run for the rock face. I could hear it roaring behind me, feel the ground shake as it gave chase. I scrambled up the rocks, my hands bleeding from the sharp edges. The creature's claws scraped against stone just inches from my feet. Laura reached down, grabbing my arm and helping to haul me up the last few feet. We squeezed through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the forest floor above. The creature's furious roars echoed from below, but the fissure was too small for it to follow. We lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the reality of our narrow escape sinking in. The forest was silent around us, the first light of dawn just beginning to filter through the trees. "We made it," Laura said, her voice filled with disbelief and relief. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but as the adrenaline began to fade, a sobering thought occurred to me. We had survived, but the creature was still out there. And now we knew that the forests we had spent our lives protecting held secrets far darker and more dangerous than we had ever imagined. As we picked ourselves up and began the long trek back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter in the Lewis and Clark National Forest was just the beginning of something much larger and more terrifying than we could possibly imagine. The journey back to the ranger station was a blur of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent us into a panic, our minds conjuring images of the creature bursting from the underbrush. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, warming the forest and chasing away the shadows, a small measure of calm began to return. We reached the trailhead just as a search party was preparing to set out. The looks on their faces as we emerged from the tree line, battered, bloodied, and wild-eyed, told me that we must have been quite a sight. The next few hours were a whirlwind of debriefings, medical checkups, and attempts to explain what we had encountered. But how could we describe something so outside the realm of normal experience? How could we make them understand the terror we had faced in those dark woods? In the end, our official report was vague and unsatisfying. We spoke of an animal attack, of getting lost in an unmapped cave system, of the tragic death of Stephen Marlowe. But we couldn't bring ourselves to mention the creature, the ancient cave drawings, or the implications of what we had discovered. As I sat in my office later that evening, nursing a strong cup of coffee and staring out at the forest beyond the station, Laura knocked on my door. "How are you holding up?" she asked, taking a seat across from me. I shook my head, still struggling to process everything that had happened. "I don't know, Laura. I keep replaying it all in my mind, trying to make sense of it, but I can't." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know. I can't stop thinking about those cave drawings. How long has that thing been out there? How many other people has it killed over the years? And how many more will it kill in the future?" I added, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me since our escape. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our knowledge hanging heavy between us. "We have to go back," Laura said finally, her voice low but determined. "We have to find a way to stop it, to protect people from it." I knew she was right, but the thought of facing that creature again filled me with dread. "It won't be easy," I warned. "We barely made it out alive this time, and now it knows we're a threat. Plus, who would believe us? Who would help us?" Laura leaned forward, her eyes intense. "We'll find a way. We have to. It's our job to protect these forests and the people who visit them. We can't just ignore what we've learned." I nodded slowly, knowing she was right. We had a responsibility, not just as search and rescue officers, but as human beings who had glimpsed a terrifying truth about the world. "All right," I said, making a decision. "We'll go back. But we need to be smart about this. We need to research, to prepare. This isn't just a search and rescue mission anymore, it's a hunt." Laura smiled grimly, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. "Then let's get started. We have a lot of work to do." As we began to plan our return to the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were embarking on something that would change our lives forever. The Lewis and Clark National Forest had always been my home, my place of work, my sanctuary. Now it had become a battlefield, and the enemy we faced was beyond anything we could have imagined. But as I looked at Laura, saw the same resolve in her eyes that I felt in my heart, I knew we weren't going into this fight alone. Whatever horrors awaited us in the depths of the forest, we would face them together. The creature may have existed for centuries, hidden in the shadows of the wilderness. But now it had made a crucial mistake. It had revealed itself to us, had made itself known, and in doing so, it had given us the chance to fight back, to protect the forests and the people we had sworn to serve. As night fell over the ranger station, casting long shadows across the land, I made a silent vow. We would return to those dark woods. We would uncover the truth behind the ancient drawings and the monstrous creature that stalked the forest. And somehow, someway, we would find a way to end the terror that had taken root in the heart of the Lewis and Clark National Forest. The hunt was on, and this time, we would be the predators. In the months that followed our terrifying encounter in the Lewis and Clark National Forest, Laura and I dedicated ourselves to uncovering the truth behind the creature we had faced. We pored over historical records, spoke with local tribal elders, and secretly returned to the cave system to study the ancient drawings. What we discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. The creature, it seemed, was known to the indigenous peoples of the area, spoken of in hushed whispers and cautionary tales passed down through generations. They called it the Shadow Walker, a being that existed between our world and another, emerging to hunt when the barriers between realities grew thin. Our research led us to other incidents over the years, mysterious disappearances, gruesome animal attacks that defied explanation, and whispered stories of encounters similar to our own. The creature had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, its existence obscured by skepticism and the human tendency to rationalize the unexplainable. As I write this account, Laura and I are preparing for another expedition into the heart of the forest. We're better prepared this time, armed with knowledge and specialized equipment. But the fear remains, a constant companion as we ready ourselves to face the unknown once again. I don't know if we'll succeed in our mission to stop the creature. I don't even know if we'll make it out alive. But I do know that we have to try, because now that we know what lurks in the shadows of the Lewis and Clark National Forest, we can never again turn a blind eye. To those who read this, I offer a warning. The wilderness is vast and ancient, filled with wonders beyond imagination. But it also harbors dangers that defy comprehension. So when you venture into the wild places of the world, remember this tale. And if you find yourself alone in the forest, with nothing but the sound of your own heartbeat for company, listen closely. For in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods, where the shadows grow long and the air grows cold, something is watching. Something is waiting. And it's hungry. This is Robert Smith, United States Forest Service, signing off. If you're reading this, it means our mission is not yet complete. But know that we will continue to fight, to protect, and to seek the truth, no matter where it leads us. Stay safe out there, and whatever you do, don't go into the woods alone. There's something about being out in the wilderness that calls to me, even though I grew up in the concrete jungle of Chicago. My name is Michael Johnson, and at 52 years old, I've always found solace in the quiet isolation of nature, especially after my divorce 5 years ago. The simple life of camping and hiking gave me a much-needed break from the cacophony of my everyday routine, allowing me to reset my frayed nerves and cluttered mind. For nearly 3 decades, I worked long hours as a software engineer at a multinational tech company. It was the kind of job that left you drained and numb, staring at lines of code until your vision blurred, and the world outside your cubicle ceased to exist. The constant deadlines, the pressure to innovate, the office politics, it all took its toll. By the time I hit my late 40s, I felt like a hollowed-out shell of the person I once was. My ex-wife Sarah used to say I was married to my job. I guess she was right. Our marriage crumbled slowly, eroded by years of neglect and misaligned priorities. When she finally left, taking our 2 kids with her, It was like waking up from a long, suffocating dream. I realized then how much I'd lost, how much time had slipped through my fingers while I was chasing promotions and stock options. But out here, in the vast expanse of wilderness, I can think, breathe, and feel alive again. The smell of pine needles, the whisper of wind through the trees, the crunch of gravel under my boots, it all serves to ground me in the present moment, washing away the regrets and what-ifs that plague my waking hours. In the summer of 2023, I decided to spend a week exploring the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. It's not the kind of place you go if you're looking for an easy hike or a comfortable glamping experience. The Bob, as it's known to locals, is rugged, remote, and unforgiving. But that's exactly what I needed, a challenge, something to shake off the city's monotony and force me to confront the raw elements of nature, and perhaps in doing so, confront myself. I'd spent months preparing for this trip, poring over topographic maps, reading trail reports, and upgrading my gear. I wanted to push deeper into the wilderness than I ever had before, to test my limits and maybe, just maybe, find some answers to the questions that had been gnawing at me since my divorce. The journey began on a crisp Monday morning in early July. I parked my weathered Subaru Outback at the benchmark trailhead, double-checked my backpack, and took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. The scent of pine and wildflowers filled my lungs, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of excitement ignite in my chest. As I shouldered my pack and took my first steps on the trail, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. I was leaving behind cell phone reception, easy access to help, and all the comforts of modern life. But with each step, that anxiety began to melt away, replaced by a sense of freedom and possibility. The first day's hike was challenging but exhilarating. The trail wound its way through dense forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of snow-capped peaks and plunging valleys. I crossed bubbling streams on log bridges, my boots gripping the worn wood as I carefully made my way across. By late afternoon, my legs were burning and sweat had soaked through my shirt, but I felt more alive than I had in years. I set up camp in a small clearing near a babbling brook, the sound of rushing water a soothing backdrop as I prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated chili. As I sat by my small campfire watching the flames dance and listening to the forest come alive with nocturnal sounds, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, not just the physical journey into the wilderness, but the emotional one as well. I thought about Sarah and the kids, wondering what they were doing at that moment. Were they happy? Did they ever think of me? The familiar ache of loss throbbed in my chest, but out here, surrounded by the vastness of nature, it felt somehow more manageable. That night, as I lay in my tent, the soft glow of starlight filtering through the nylon, I drifted off to sleep with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Little did I know that this tranquility was about to be shattered in ways I couldn't have imagined. The next morning dawned clear and bright. I broke camp early, eager to cover more ground and push deeper into the wilderness. The trail became more challenging as I ascended, switchbacking up steep slopes and traversing narrow ridgelines. My calves burned with the effort, but the views more than made up for the discomfort. By mid-afternoon, I had reached my destination for the day, a secluded lake nestled between two towering mountain peaks. The area was breathtakingly beautiful, almost too perfect to be real. The lake's surface was a mirror reflecting the azure sky and the rugged peaks that surrounded it. A gentle breeze rustled through the pines, carrying with it the scent of sun-warmed stone and wild grass. I pitched my tent on a soft patch of grass near the shore, taking care to follow leave-no-trace principles. There was no one else around, just me and the wilderness stretching out in all directions. As I sat on a sun-warmed rock, preparing my freeze-dried dinner, I felt a profound sense of solitude wash over me. It wasn't the loneliness that had plagued me back in the city, but rather a feeling of connection to something vast and ancient. That night, the sky was clear and filled with more stars than I'd ever seen. Away from the light pollution of Chicago, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. I lay on my back, gazing up at the cosmic display, feeling simultaneously insignificant and deeply connected to the universe. It was the kind of night that makes you believe in something bigger than yourself, that makes you question your place in the grand scheme of things. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace and possibility that I hadn't experienced in years. But that peace was about to be shattered. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. I was jolted awake by a strange sound, something between a high-pitched scream and a guttural moan. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, and I've heard my fair share over years of camping and hiking. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. It was coming from the direction of the lake. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Fumbling in the darkness, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the chilly night. The lake was still, eerily so, reflecting the stars above like a black mirror. But something felt wrong. The air was too thick, too quiet, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing out of the ordinary. The sound didn't come again, but the silence that followed was almost worse. It felt expectant, as if the entire forest was waiting for something to happen. I stood there for what felt like hours, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts, visible in the cold night air. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then, to hike through the night until I reached civilization. But another part, the part that had driven me to come out here in the first place, refused to be chased off by what might have been nothing more than a trick of the wind or an unfamiliar animal. Eventually I convinced myself that it must have been a bad dream, or maybe some distant animal call distorted by the mountain acoustics. I crawled back into my tent, zipping it up tightly as if the thin nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, every snapping twig or rustling leaf sending a jolt of adrenaline through my system. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were filled with shapeless terrors and echoing screams. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the horrors of the night seeming distant and foolish in the warm light of day. I emerged from my tent, stretching my stiff muscles and breathing in the crisp mountain air. The lake was calm, its surface broken only by the occasional jump of a fish. As I prepared my breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I tried to rationalize the events of the previous night. It was probably just an owl or some other nocturnal creature, I told myself. The isolation and darkness can play tricks on the mind, making ordinary sounds seem sinister. But as I packed up my campsite, preparing for another day of hiking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed quieter than it should have been, the usual morning chorus of birdsong noticeably absent, and there was something else, a faint smell in the air that I couldn't quite place. It was metallic, almost coppery, like old pennies or... I shook my head, pushing the thought away. I was letting my imagination run wild, seeing threats where there were none. This was why I had come out here after all, to challenge myself, to face my fears and overcome them. With my pack secured and a determined set to my jaw, I set off down the trail, leaving the lake behind. But as I hiked, I couldn't help glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from the water or lurking at the edge of the trees. Little did I know this was only the beginning. The true test of my courage and my sanity was yet to come. As the day wore on, the uneasy feeling in my gut only grew stronger. The trail wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine, their straight trunks creating a claustrophobic tunnel effect. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of pine needles that muffled my footsteps, adding to the eerie silence that seemed to permeate the air. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had begun to gather on the horizon, promising a storm. The wind picked up, carrying with it that same metallic scent I'd noticed earlier. It was stronger now, unmistakable. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe there was an old mine nearby, leaching minerals into the soil and water. I tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on finding a suitable campsite before the storm hit. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement in the trees to my left. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and wind-rustled leaves. "Get a grip, Michael," I muttered to myself, but my hand shook slightly as I adjusted my pack. As if on cue, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. I picked up my pace, scanning the area for a sheltered spot to set up camp. The first few raindrops began to fall just as I found a small clearing protected by a rocky overhang. I hurriedly set up my tent, the wind tugging at the fabric as I secured the guy lines. By the time I crawled inside, the rain was coming down in sheets. Lightning flashed, illuminating the interior of my tent in stark white bursts. That's when I heard it again, that same unearthly scream from the night before, barely audible over the howling wind and driving rain. It sounded closer this time, much closer. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing nothing but the rain-soaked forest beyond my tent flap. But as another flash of lightning lit up the sky, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark shape, massive and hunched, moving between the trees. It was only visible for a split second, but that was enough. Whatever it was no bear or other animal I recognized. Its movements were too fluid, too purposeful. I zipped up my tent with trembling hands, knowing full well how little protection the thin nylon would provide against whatever was out there. Sleep was out of the question. I sat up all night, flashlight in one hand, my hunting knife in the other, listening to the storm rage and that thing move around my campsite. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. The forest was shrouded in a thick mist, limiting visibility to just a few yards. I packed up quickly, my movements fueled by a potent mixture of fear and adrenaline. I needed to get out of there, to make it back to civilization and figure out what was going on. But as I studied my map, my heart sank. The fastest way out would take me past that lake again, the same lake where this nightmare had begun. With no other choice, I set off, every sense on high alert. The forest was unnaturally quiet in the storm's aftermath. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the drip of water from saturated leaves and my own labored breathing. As I approached the lake, that metallic smell grew stronger, almost overpowering. The mist swirled and eddied, playing tricks on my eyes. More than once I thought I saw shapes moving in the gloom, only for them to resolve into innocuous trees or rocks when I looked closer. Then I saw it, a large dark shape partially submerged at the edge of the lake. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't a log or a rock. It was something else entirely. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. As I got closer, I began to make out details that sent a chill down my spine. The shape was massive, easily the size of a small car. Its surface was strange, irregular, covered in what looked like thick, bony plates. Suddenly, the thing moved. A limb, or was it a tentacle, broke the surface of the water, thrashing for a moment before disappearing back beneath the murky depths. I stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to get away. That's when I heard it. That same terrifying scream moan, but this time it was coming from right behind me. I spun around and found myself face to face with a nightmare. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. It was a grotesque mix of reptilian and amphibian features, with a body that seemed to constantly shift and change as I looked at it. Its skin was slick and dark, covered in those same bony plates I'd seen on the thing in the lake. But its eyes, God, its eyes. They were intelligent, aware, and they were fixed directly on me. I ran like I've never run before in my life. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, moving with an unnatural speed for something so large. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, but still I pushed on. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I burst into a clearing and saw something that made me want to cry with relief, an old abandoned cabin. Without hesitation, I sprinted for it, slamming the door shut behind me. The cabin was small, with a single room and a broken window, but it felt like a fortress compared to the open wilderness. I could hear the creature outside, circling the cabin, scratching at the walls. The smell of metal filled the air again, stronger than before. I knew the cabin wouldn't hold for long. My eyes darted around the room looking for something, anything that could help me. Then I saw it. A rusted hunting rifle mounted on the wall. I grabbed it, checked the chamber, and found one lone bullet inside. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I positioned myself near the door, rifle at the ready, and waited. The creature was relentless, slamming against the walls, trying to force its way in. The wood creaked and groaned, and I knew it was only a matter of time. Just as the door began to splinter, I made a decision. I wasn't going to die cowering in fear. With a yell that was part terror and part defiance, I yanked the door open and fired. The shot echoed through the cabin, deafening in the confined space. The creature let out a sound that made my skin crawl, a mix between a roar and a hiss before collapsing to the ground. I didn't wait to see if it was dead. I ran, bursting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the edge of the wilderness where my car was parked. I didn't look back, didn't stop running until I was safely inside, engine roaring to life as I sped away from that cursed place. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them everything. To my surprise, they didn't laugh or call me crazy. The sheriff, a weathered man named Jim Hawkins, listened to my story with a grim expression. "You're not the first to come out of those woods with a story like that," he said after I'd finished. "Most folks, we figure they just got spooked by a bear or mountain lion, but sometimes—" He trailed off, then stood up. "I think you'd better come with me." Hawkins led me to a small, locked room at the back of the station. Inside were files, dozens of them, all labeled with dates going back decades. He pulled one out and handed it to me. 1978, he said. Hiker goes missing in the Bob. Search party finds his campsite torn to shreds. They also found other things that didn't make it into the official report. I opened the file with trembling hands. Inside were photos, blurry but clear enough to make out shapes that looked disturbingly similar to what I'd seen. There were also sketches, eyewitness accounts, all describing creatures that shouldn't exist. What is all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Hawkins sighed heavily. "We don't know, not for sure. But whatever's out there, it's been there a long time. And it's not just in the Bob. We've got reports from all over. Yellowstone, Glacier, the Bitterroots. Always in the deep wilderness, always just at the edge of belief." He took the file back, returning it to its place. "We do what we can. Monitor the areas, warn folks to be careful. But we can't close down half the state on account of something we can't explain or prove." I nodded, still trying to process everything. "What happens now?" "Now?" Hawkins gave me a look that was part sympathy, part warning. "Now you go home, try to forget what you saw. And if you can't forget, well, you learn to live with it, just like the rest of us." As I left the sheriff's office, I felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd seen was real, or at least as real as anything in this world. But unease at the knowledge that out there in the wilderness I'd always seen as a refuge lurked things beyond my understanding. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the events of the past few days. When I finally reached my apartment in Chicago, it felt alien, disconnected from the reality I'd experienced in Montana. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to return to my normal life. I went back to work, met with friends, even started dating again. But everything felt different. The city that had once felt suffocating now felt safe, its noise and bustle a comforting barrier against the unknown. I found myself researching cryptozoology, folklore, and unexplained phenomena. I joined online forums where people shared similar experiences, finding a strange comfort in their stories. Some nights I woke up in a cold sweat, the creature's eyes vivid in my mind. As time passed, the intensity of the memories faded, but they never truly went away. They became a part of me, a secret knowledge that both thrilled and terrified me. I still go hiking and camping, but never alone, and never in the deep wilderness. I've found a new appreciation for state parks and well-traveled trails. And if sometimes, when the wind blows just right and carries with it a hint of pine and wild places, I feel a shiver run down my spine, well, that's just something I've learned to live with. Because I know now that there are things out there, in the vast wilderness of our world, that defy explanation. Things that lurk just beyond the reach of our understanding, waiting in the shadows of ancient forests and mist-shrouded mountains. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just stumble upon them. My name is Cade Sullivan, and I've been a park ranger at Arches National Park in Utah for the past 7 years. What I'm about to share is an account of events that occurred in the spring of 2023. I've debated for months whether to come forward with this story, but I feel an obligation to share what happened, even if it means risking my career and credibility. Before I begin, I want to make it clear that I'm a rational person. I grew up on a farm in Nebraska, studied environmental science in college, and have always prided myself on my practical, no-nonsense approach to life. What I experienced in Arches defies explanation, and I'm still struggling to come to terms with it. But I know what I saw, and I believe the public deserves to know the truth about what's lurking in one of America's most beloved national parks. Arches National Park is a place of stark beauty and otherworldly landscapes. Spread across 76,679 acres of high desert in eastern Utah, it's home to over 2,000 natural stone arches, as well as an incredible variety of geological formations that seem to defy gravity and logic. I first came to Arches as a seasonal ranger in 2016, fresh out of college and eager to escape the crowded cities where I'd spent my university years. Something about the vast open spaces and the silence of the desert called to me. By the end of that first summer, I knew I wanted to make this place my home. It took a couple of years of seasonal work and additional training, but in 2018 I was offered a full-time position as a park ranger. I was elated. Finally, I had found my place in the world. For the first few years, life at Arches was everything I had hoped it would be. My days were filled with leading interpretive hikes, assisting visitors, and patrolling the park's extensive network of trails. I loved the work, and I felt a deep connection to the land and its history. But as time went on, I began to notice things. Small things at first, easily dismissed as tricks of light or overactive imagination. A shadow moving where no shadow should be. The feeling of being watched when I was alone on a remote trail. Strange sounds echoing through the canyons at night, sounds that didn't match any wildlife I knew of. I brushed these experiences off, attributing them to the isolation and the sometimes disorienting nature of the desert landscape. But looking back now, I realized these were the first warning signs of what was to come. In the months leading up to the incident, life had become increasingly challenging. My long-term relationship had ended abruptly, leaving me feeling adrift and alone. The isolation that I had once cherished began to feel oppressive. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra shifts and volunteering for the most remote patrols. It was during this time that I began to notice more concrete oddities in the park. Visitors would occasionally report strange sightings, unexplained lights in the night sky, peculiar tracks that didn't match any known wildlife, and eerie sounds echoing through the canyons. Most of these reports were dismissed as the product of overexcited imaginations or misidentified natural phenomena. But a few stuck with me, nagging at the edges of my consciousness. One incident in particular stands out in my memory. It was about 2 months before my encounter in the cave. I was on a routine patrol of the Devil's Garden area when I came across a group of hikers who seemed visibly shaken. They claimed to have seen a large animal-like creature moving among the rock formations. When I pressed for details, their descriptions were vague and contradictory. Some said it moved on all fours, others insisted it was bipedal. The only thing they agreed on was its size, much larger than a human, and the overwhelming sense of dread it inspired. I searched the area thoroughly, but found no evidence of any large animal. The incident was logged and largely forgotten, chalked up to the overwrought imaginations of city dwellers unused to the wilderness. But it planted a seed of unease in my mind. Around this time, I also began to experience vivid, unsettling dreams. Night after night, I found myself wandering through twisted versions of familiar park landscapes. The arches would stretch and contort impossibly, and always there was a sense of being pursued by something just out of sight. I would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, the memory of gleaming eyes and sharp teeth fading like mist in the morning sun. I didn't share these experiences with my colleagues. Park rangers are a practical bunch, and I didn't want to be seen as unstable or unreliable. But the dreams, combined with the strange reports and my own growing sense of unease, left me on edge. Looking back, I can see how all of these factors, My personal struggles, the isolation, the odd occurrences in the park, and my disturbing dreams were building towards something. But at the time, I had no idea of the horror that awaited me. May 15th, 2023 started like any other day. I woke before dawn, made a pot of strong coffee, and watched the sun rise over the red rock landscape from the porch of my small ranger cabin. The air was crisp and clean, with just a hint of the heat that would build as the day progressed. My shift began at 6 a.m. I checked in at the ranger station, going through the usual morning briefing with the night shift. Nothing unusual had been reported overnight. A few campers had complained about strange noises, but that was par for the course. The desert night can play tricks on those unused to its unique soundscape. By 8 a.m. I was out on patrol. My assigned area for the day was the Devil's Garden Trail, one of the park's most popular hikes. It's a 7.2-mile loop that takes visitors past 8 impressive arches, including the famous landscape arch. On a typical day, hundreds of hikers would make their way along this trail. The morning was quiet, with just a few early risers heading out. I nodded and exchanged pleasantries with the hikers I passed, reminding them to stay hydrated and stick to the marked trails. But as I walked, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was bothering me. Around 9:30 a.m., I radioed into Ellie, another ranger who was staffing the visitor center that morning. Ellie and I had started at Arches around the same time, and she'd become one of my closest friends in the park. "Morning, Cade," Ellie's cheerful voice crackled over the radio. "Anything exciting planned today?" I forced a laugh, trying to sound more upbeat than I felt. "Just the usual. Maybe I'll find someone trying to climb Delicate Arch again." "Good luck with that," she replied. "I'm stuck in the visitor center until noon. Holler if you need backup." "Will do," I said, though I didn't expect to need help. Little did I know how wrong I would be. I continued along the trail, the red rocks glowing in the morning sun. The formations here were truly stunning, fins of sandstone jutting up from the earth like the spines of some colossal beast. But today their beauty felt somehow ominous, as if the rocks themselves were watching me. It was as I neared the end of the trail, not far from Double O Arch, that I noticed something strange. There was a small, unmarked path leading off the main trail. Now I know every inch of this park, or at least I thought I did, but I had never seen this path before. I stood there for a moment, considering my options. Park rules are strict about staying on marked trails, both for visitor safety and to protect the delicate desert ecosystem. But something about this path intrigued me. It was narrow, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and it seemed to wind its way between two massive fins of rock. Maybe it was the boredom of another routine day, or maybe it was that nagging feeling of wrongness that had been dogging me all morning. Whatever the reason, I decided to investigate. I radioed Ellie again. "Hey, I found something odd out here, an unmarked trail. I'm going to check it out." There was a pause before Ellie responded, her voice tinged with concern. "Be careful, Cade. Could be some idiot trying to make their own trail." "Yeah, probably," I replied, though I wasn't so sure. There was something about this path that didn't feel like the work of overeager hikers. I clicked off the radio and stepped onto the narrow path. The ground was uneven, the rocks sharp and jagged beneath my boots. I followed it for about 10 minutes, winding through the arches and fins. The trail seemed to be leading deeper into a part of the park I wasn't familiar with, which was disconcerting in itself. Finally, the path opened up into a small clearing, and there, in the middle of the clearing, was a cave. I've been all over this park. I've studied its maps, explored its backcountry, and thought I knew every nook and cranny. But I had never seen or heard of this cave before. It wasn't marked on any map I knew of, and I'd never heard any of the other rangers mention it. The entrance was low and narrow, almost hidden behind a jumble of fallen rocks. It looked old, ancient even, as if it had been there for millennia, quietly waiting to be discovered. I stood there for a long moment, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn back, to report the find and let a team investigate properly. But another part of me, the part that had been feeling restless and uneasy for weeks, wanted to push forward. As I approached the cave entrance, a cold breeze blew out from the darkness. It was odd. This far into the desert, you don't get cold air like that. It was as if the cave itself was breathing. I drew my flashlight and, after a moment's hesitation, my Glock 17. It was standard issue for all rangers, and while I'd never had to use it for anything more threatening than the occasional aggressive wildlife, its weight was reassuring in my hand. Taking a deep breath, I ducked into the cave entrance. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. I had to crouch to get through the entrance, but after a few feet, the cave opened up into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rough stone walls and a floor littered with debris. There were bones scattered about. Animal bones, I told myself, though a voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. Broken pottery lay half buried in the dirt, its designs unfamiliar to me. And then I saw something else, something that made my blood run cold. It looked like hair, long strands of it, matted and dirty, lying in clumps on the cave floor. I knelt down to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. Half buried in the dirt was a human skull. The hair, dark and matted, was still attached to the scalp. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'd seen dead bodies before. It's an unfortunate part of the job when you work in wilderness areas. But this was different. This skull was old, ancient even, but the hair looked like it hadn't aged a day. I reached for my radio, intending to call for backup, but before I could, I heard something. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the cave. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like a distant avalanche. I stood up, shining my flashlight deeper into the darkness. The beam wavered, flickering as if something was interfering with the light. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by my wavering flashlight beam. But then I saw it again, something big, something with a hulking form, moving towards me from the shadows. My flashlight flickered again, and when it came back on, I got my first clear look at the creature. What I saw defied everything I knew about the natural world. The thing was massive, easily 8 feet tall at the shoulder. It moved on all fours like a bear, but its body was all wrong, too long, too lean, covered in thick, matted fur that seemed to absorb the light. But it was the creature's face that truly horrified me. The head was elongated, like a wolf's, but grotesquely oversized for its body. And the mouth, the mouth was full of jagged teeth, row upon row of them, more than any natural animal should have. Its eyes glowed in the beam of my flashlight, reflecting an unnatural pale blue light. I raised my gun, backing away slowly, but the creature kept coming. It didn't seem to be in a hurry, just stalking me, as if it knew I had nowhere to go. The cave suddenly felt much smaller, the walls closing in around me. My training kicked in, and I squeezed off a shot, aiming for the creature's head. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the cave, and I was momentarily blinded by the muzzle flash. When my vision cleared, I saw that the bullet had only grazed the creature's fur. It snarled, a deep, bone-chilling sound that made my blood run cold. My mind was racing. This thing shouldn't exist. It didn't belong in any world I knew. Yet here it was, very real and very dangerous. The creature lunged at me, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. I fired again, this time hitting it in the shoulder. The creature let out a howl of pain that shook dust from the cave ceiling. But it didn't stop. If anything, the wound only seemed to make it angrier. I turned and ran, sprinting for the entrance of the cave. But the creature was fast, too fast. I could hear its heavy footsteps behind me, the sound of its claws scraping against the stone floor. The cave entrance seemed impossibly far away. I burst out of the cave, gasping for air, but I knew the creature was right behind me. I turned and fired again, this time hitting it in the chest as it emerged from the cave mouth. The creature roared and stumbled, but it didn't fall. In that moment, I knew I couldn't outrun it. The thing was too fast, too strong. My only chance was to use the terrain to my advantage. I made a split-second decision and ran towards the nearest arch, hoping I could climb up and out of the creature's reach. The creature followed, its eyes locked on me. I could feel its hot breath on my neck, smell the stench of decay coming off its fur. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. I reached the base of the arch and scrambled up the rock face, my hands slipping on the rough surface. Years of rock climbing experience paid off as I climbed faster than I ever had before, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. I made it to the top of the arch just as the creature lunged at me. It missed by inches, its claws scraping against the rock where I had been moments before. The creature crashed into the base of the arch, momentarily stunned. I took the opportunity to reload my gun, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the bullets. Below me, the creature was already recovering, shaking its massive head and turning its gaze back to me. It began to climb, its claws digging into the rock with terrifying ease. I took aim and fired again and again and again. The creature's head jerked back as one of the bullets found its mark, hitting it square between its glowing eyes. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The creature swayed, its eyes dulling. Then, with a sound like a falling tree, it toppled backwards, crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. I stayed on top of the arch for a long time, watching the creature's body, waiting for it to move. But it didn't. Slowly, painfully aware of every ache in my body, I climbed down. I approached the creature's body cautiously, my gun still trained on it. Even in death, it was a terrifying sight. Its body was even more massive up close, easily the size of a small car. The fur was matted with blood, both its own and, I realized with a chill, what looked like older bloodstains. I kicked it, just to be sure it was really dead. When it didn't react, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. With shaking hands, I reached for my radio. "Ellie," I said, my voice hoarse and barely recognizable. "I need backup. Now." There was a moment of silence. Then Ellie's voice came through, tight with concern. "Cade? What's wrong? Where are you?" I looked around, trying to get my bearings. I'm near Double O Arch. There's a hidden path. I'll mark it. Ellie, you're not going to believe this, but I need you to listen carefully." Over the next few minutes, I told her everything. The cave, the skull, the creature. As I spoke, I could hear the disbelief in her voice. But to her credit, she didn't question me. "I'm calling in everyone available," she said when I finished. "Stay where you are. We'll be there as soon as we can." I sat down heavily on a nearby rock, my eyes never leaving the creature's body. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I could feel exhaustion and pain setting in. My hands were scraped raw from the climb, and I was pretty sure I had sprained an ankle during the chase. It felt like hours, but it was probably only about 30 minutes before I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Soon, the area was swarming with park rangers and local law enforcement. I watched their faces as they came upon the scene, saw the same shock and disbelief I had felt. Ellie was one of the first to reach me. She took one look at the creature's body and went pale. "Oh my God, Cade," she whispered. "What is that thing?" "I don't know," I said, my voice hollow. "I really don't know." The next few hours were a blur. I was checked over by paramedics, debriefed by my superiors, and questioned by law enforcement. I told my story over and over, each time expecting to be told I was crazy, that I had imagined it all. But the evidence was right there, impossible to deny. As night fell, more people arrived, men in dark suits who didn't introduce themselves, scientists with wide eyes and excited whispers. They swarmed over the creature's body, taking samples and photographs. I watched as they hauled the carcass away, loading it onto a large truck. In the harsh lights they had set up, I got one last good look at it. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. Whatever it was, it didn't belong in this world. The official story, released to the public a week later, was that a large, unidentified animal had been found dead in a remote area of the park. There was no mention of the cave, the chase, or the fact that I had killed it. The park was closed for routine maintenance for a month. During that time, I was questioned extensively by various government agencies. They were particularly interested in the cave and its contents. A team was sent to investigate, but by the time they got there, the entrance had collapsed. Whether this was natural or intentional, I never found out. I was told in no uncertain terms that I was not to speak about what had happened to anyone outside of the official investigation. They didn't threaten me outright, but the implications were clear. For a while, I tried to go back to my normal routine, but things had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I was out in the park. The arches and rock formations that I had once found beautiful now seemed sinister, hiding unknown dangers. My colleagues treated me differently too. Some avoided me, clearly uncomfortable with what had happened. Others, like Ellie, tried to be supportive, but I could see the questions in their eyes, the things they wanted to ask but didn't dare to. The dreams got worse. Night after night I found myself back in that cave, facing that creature. Sometimes I managed to kill it. Other times, well, the dreams where I didn't wake up screaming were the rare ones. After 3 months, I couldn't take it anymore. I resigned from my position at Arches, citing personal reasons. The Park Service was surprisingly accommodating, perhaps relieved to see me go. I moved back to Nebraska, took a job as a forest ranger in a small state park. It's quieter here, less dramatic. The forests are dense and green, about as far from the red rocks of Utah as you can get. But I can't forget. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find any information about similar creatures or incidents. There are stories out there, whispers on obscure forums and in old folklore, of things that don't quite fit into our understanding of the natural world. But nothing concrete, nothing that explains what I saw that day. I'm sharing this story now, against the explicit instructions I was given, because I believe the public has a right to know. There are things out there, in the wild places of our world, that defy explanation. Things that perhaps we're not meant to understand. I don't know if there are more creatures like the one I encountered. I don't know if it was a lone anomaly or part of something bigger. But I do know this. The next time you're out in the wilderness, and you get that prickly feeling on the back of your neck like you're being watched, pay attention. The world is wider and stranger than we know, and not all of its secrets are benign. As for me, I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the memory of gleaming teeth and glowing eyes fresh in my mind. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that day in Arches. But I hope that by sharing this story, I can at least warn others. The wild places of our world are beautiful, but they can also be dangerous in ways we can't begin to imagine. Be careful out there. And if you ever find yourself in Arches National Park, stick to the marked trails. Some things are better left undiscovered. It's been a year since the incident at Arches, and life has settled into a new kind of normal. I still work as a forest ranger, finding some peace in the quiet routines of park maintenance and visitor assistance. But I'm always alert, always watching. Last month I received a strange letter. There was no return address, just a postmark from Moab, Utah. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. It's not over. They found another one. I don't know who sent it or what it means. Part of me wants to ignore it, to finally put this chapter of my life behind me. But I know I can't. Whatever is out there, whatever I stumbled upon in that cave, it's bigger than me. And I have a feeling my part in this story isn't over yet. So I'm packing my bags. Tomorrow I'm heading back to Utah, back to Arches. I don't know what I'll find there, but I know I have to go. The truth is out there, hidden in the red rocks and twisting canyons. And this time, I'm going to find it. If you're reading this, wish me luck. And remember, the world is stranger than we know. Stay safe out there. It was the kind of night that made you question your sanity. Cold, dark, and silent in a way that wasn't peaceful but oppressive. I was sitting in the squad car, staring at the dashboard clock, watching the seconds tick by, each one louder than the last. The town of Cannon, Colorado wasn't known for much. A few hundred people, a diner, a gas station, and a police station where I spent most of my time. It was 1994, and I was the night shift cop. They called me Ed, short for Edward Jacobs. My wife used to joke that I had a face for radio, a voice that matched, and the patience of a saint. She left me 3 years ago, but I wasn't bitter much. She couldn't handle the long hours, the lonely nights, or the fact that I didn't mind either. It's not normal, she'd say. You're not normal. Maybe she was right. Cannon was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was nestled in a valley, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. The main street was lined with small businesses, Joe's Hardware, the Cannon Diner, and the Sunshine Motel, which hadn't seen much sunshine in years. The town had seen better days, but it was home. I'd been on the force for 15 years, watching the town slowly change. The sawmill that had been the lifeblood of Cannon closed down in '89, and things had been tough ever since. People left, looking for work in bigger cities. Those who stayed behind struggled to make ends meet. It made for a tense atmosphere, like a pot always on the verge of boiling over. Tonight, though, something felt off. It wasn't the usual quiet. It was a silence that seemed to press in on you, like the air was waiting for something. I'd been sitting in the car for hours, parked at the edge of the forest where Route 52 met the old logging road just outside town. The forest was thick here, dense with pine and aspen, the kind of place where the dark could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. It was a place with history, bad history. People went missing here, or worse. Old-timers talked about the forest in hushed tones, telling stories of strange lights and eerie sounds. Most folks chalked it up to too much moonshine and an overactive imagination. But there were enough unexplained disappearances over the years to make even the most skeptical person wonder. The radio crackled, startling me out of my thoughts. It was Frank, the dispatcher. "Ed, you there?" "Yeah," I replied, voice low, trying not to startle myself. "We got a call from Sarah Abernathy. Says Tom hasn't come home from his hunt. He was supposed to be back by noon. Said he was heading up Eagle Ridge." Eagle Ridge, I knew it well. A treacherous part of the forest, not far from where I was. It wasn't like Tom to be late, and it sure as hell wasn't like him not to call. Tom was an ex-Marine, tough as nails, but even the toughest guys could have accidents. "I'll check it out," I said, already starting the car. The old Ford grumbled to life, headlights cutting into the dark as I pulled onto the dirt road. The wind picked up, pushing against the trees, making them sway like they were whispering secrets to one another. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The drive to Eagle Ridge was short, but it felt like it took forever. The trees closed in around the road, branches scraping against the car like bony fingers. I turned onto the narrow trail that led up to the ridge, my headlights barely piercing the thick underbrush. After a few minutes I saw it, Tom's pickup truck, parked at the end of the trail, half hidden by the trees. The door was open and his rifle was propped against the front seat, but there was no sign of Tom. I got out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was colder here, the wind sharper. I called out his name, but the only response was the rustling of leaves. My breath hung in the air as I moved toward the truck, scanning the area with my flashlight. There was something on the ground, a trail of blood leading into the woods. Not a lot, but enough to tell me that something was very wrong. I followed it, heart pounding in my chest, the beam of my flashlight flickering as if the batteries were dying. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding through the trees like a serpent. The further I went, the thicker the trees became, closing in around me until it felt like I was walking through a tunnel. The wind was gone now, replaced by a heavy stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then I saw it. Something large, a shape in the darkness, hunched over, feeding on something. My breath caught in my throat as I raised the flashlight. It was an animal, but not like anything I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily the size of a bear, but its body was wrong. It had long, sinewy limbs covered in matted fur, and its back was hunched like it had been broken in several places. It turned its head towards me, and I saw its face, if you could call it that. It was a twisted, malformed thing with a snout that jutted out unnaturally, and a mouth that seemed to stretch too wide, filled with sharp, broken teeth. I didn't have time to react before it charged at me, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something its size. I fired my gun, the shots echoing through the trees, but the thing didn't stop. It was on me in a second, knocking me to the ground with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I felt its claws rake across my chest, tearing through my uniform and into my flesh. I managed to kick it off, scrambling to my feet as I fired again, this time hitting it in the side. It let out a horrible sound, somewhere between a scream and a roar, and fell back. I didn't wait to see if it would get up again. I ran, stumbling through the trees, the sound of the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. I could feel the blood running down my chest, the pain sharp and burning. But I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I burst out of the trees and into the clearing where Tom's truck was. But Tom wasn't in the truck. He was lying a few feet away, face down in the dirt, a bloody mess. His rifle was still slung over his shoulder, unused. I could see now what the creature had been feeding on. I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys as the thing burst out of the trees behind me. I got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as the creature lunged at the window. The glass shattered, but the door held. I started the engine and floored it, tires spinning in the dirt as I sped down the trail. I didn't stop driving until I reached the station. I stumbled inside, bloodied and out of breath, collapsing into a chair as Frank and a couple of the guys rushed over. They took one look at me and knew something was very wrong. I told them what happened, every detail. They listened, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Frank was the first to speak. "Jesus Christ, Ed. We need to call the state police, maybe even the feds." I shook my head. "No one's going to believe this, Frank. We need to handle it ourselves." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "All right, what's the plan?" "We go back," I said, wincing as I stood up. "We need to get Tom's body, and we need to find that thing before it hurts anyone else." Frank led the way, a shotgun in his hands, the others following with rifles. But when we got to the truck, the creature was gone. The only thing left was Tom's body, torn apart, and the blood-stained earth where the creature had stood. We found tracks, deep gouges in the dirt where it had run, but nothing else. We searched the woods for hours, but there was no sign of it, not even a trace. They believed me, though. How could they not? The evidence was right there, staring them in the face. The next few days were a blur. We had to tell Sarah about Tom. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. She collapsed when we told her, her screams echoing through the small house. The official report said it was an animal attack, probably a bear. But we all knew the truth. The town was on edge. People were scared to go into the woods. Hunters went out in groups, armed to the teeth. But the creature never came back. Or at least if it did, we never found out. Weeks turned into months. The town tried to move on, but there was a tension in the air that never quite went away. People looked at the forest differently now, with fear and suspicion, and they looked at me differently too. They knew I had seen something out there, something that didn't fit into their understanding of the world. I threw myself into work, spending long hours patrolling the town and the surrounding areas. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, that there was more to the story than what I had seen that night. It was about 6 months after that night when I started digging deeper. I couldn't let it go. The image of that creature, the sound of its roar, they haunted my dreams. I needed answers. I started with the town records, looking for any similar incidents in the past. It didn't take long to find something. In 1952, a logger named John Hawkins had gone missing in the same area. His body was never found, but his axe was discovered, covered in blood that wasn't human. Then there was the case of the Miller family in 1978. They had gone camping near Eagle Ridge and never returned. The official report said they probably got lost and died of exposure, but their campsite was found intact, with no signs of a struggle. The more I dug, the more cases I found. Every few decades something would happen. People would go missing or turn up dead in ways that didn't make sense, and always in the same area of the forest. I reached out to some contacts in other towns, asking if they had ever seen or heard of anything similar. Most of them laughed it off, but a few got quiet. They had stories of their own, whispered accounts of things seen in the dark that shouldn't exist. One night, about a year after the incident, I got a call from an old-timer named Bill Johnson. He said he had something to show me, something that might help explain what I had seen. I drove out to his cabin on the outskirts of town. Bill was in his 80s, a former logger who had lived in Cannon all his life. He led me into his cluttered living room and pulled out an old leather-bound book. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said, his hand shaking as he opened it. "He was one of the first settlers in this area. He wrote about things he saw in the forest, things that weren't natural." I flipped through the pages, my heart racing. The book was filled with detailed drawings and descriptions of creatures that looked disturbingly similar to what I had seen that night. But there was more. The book talked about old Native American legends, about a place in the forest where the veil between worlds was thin. They called it the Hungry Ground, Bill said, his voice barely above a whisper. They said it was a place where things from the other side could cross over, things that feed on fear and pain. I left Bill's cabin with more questions than answers, but also with a sense of purpose. I wasn't crazy. There was something out there, something that had been haunting these woods for generations. It was almost exactly a year after Tom's death when it happened again. A group of hikers went missing near Eagle Ridge. When the call came in, I knew in my gut what we were dealing with. This time I was prepared. I had been studying Bill's book, learning everything I could about the hungry ground and the things that came from it. I gathered a team: Frank, a couple of the younger deputies, and Bill's grandson, Jake, who knew the woods better than anyone. We set out at dawn, armed with more than just guns. We had charms and talismans that Bill had given us, things he said would protect us from the creature. I didn't know if I believed in all that, but I wasn't taking any chances. The forest was quiet as we made our way up the ridge, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of leaves under our feet. We found the hikers' campsite first. It was a mess, tents torn apart, equipment scattered everywhere, and there was blood, a lot of it. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We formed a circle, backs to each other, weapons ready. It came at us from the trees, moving so fast it was just a blur. But this time we were ready. We opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the forest. The creature howled in pain, but it didn't go down. It charged at Jake, knocking him to the ground. I saw its jaws open wide, ready to tear into him. Without thinking, I threw myself at the creature, ramming into it with all my strength. We tumbled down the slope, a tangle of limbs and fur and teeth. I felt its claws rake across my back, felt its hot breath on my face, but I didn't let go. I pressed the charm Bill had given me against its skin and started reciting the words he had taught me. The creature let out a scream that shook the trees. Its body began to twist and contort as if it was being pulled apart from the inside. There was a flash of light so bright it blinded me, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. In its place was a scorched patch of earth, still smoking. We found the hikers, or what was left of them, in a cave nearby. It was a grim scene, but at least we could give their families closure. As we made our way back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The creature was gone, but the hungry ground remained. And as long as it did, there would always be a risk of something coming through. It's been 10 years since that day on the ridge. I'm not a cop anymore. These days I spend my time researching, documenting cases like ours from all over the country. There's more out there than most people realize, more than they want to know. Canon's changed. The town's smaller now. A lot of people left after what happened. Those who stayed, they know the truth. They respect the forest, fear it a little too. I still go out there sometimes, to the edge of the hungry ground. I stand there and listen to the whispers in the wind, wondering what's on the other side, waiting to cross over. But that's not my concern anymore. I did my job. That's all there was to it. Now I just try to make sure others are prepared for what's out there in the dark. Because there are things in this world that don't belong, things waiting in the shadows. And sometimes the only thing standing between them and the rest of the world is a small town cop with a flashlight and a gun. The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the scent of impending winter and something else, something older, wilder, and infinitely more dangerous. James Garcia, 63 years old and the longest-serving deputy in Harlan, Montana, felt it in his bones. He'd lived in this small town his entire life, watching it shrink as the younger generation fled to bigger cities, leaving behind a community of hardy souls who valued peace and quiet above all else. But on this night in October 1992, the quiet was shattered by a wind that seemed to whisper dark secrets. James sat in his patrol car, a battered Ford Crown Victoria that had seen better days, much like the town itself. The radio crackled to life, startling him from his reverie. "Deputy Garcia, come in, over." James picked up the receiver, his weathered hands steady despite the chill that ran down his spine. "Garcia here. What's the situation?" "We've got a call from Wallace Gibson out by the Hollows. Says he's seen something unusual. Probably just the wind playing tricks, but can you swing by and check it out? James sighed, glancing at his watch. It was nearly 11 p.m., and he'd been looking forward to ending his shift. But duty called, and in a town like Harlan, everyone looked out for each other. 10:04, I'm on my way. As he turned the car towards the outskirts of town, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was different tonight. The Hollows had always been a place of local legend, a stretch of dense forest that even the most seasoned hunters avoided. Kids dared each other to venture in, but few ever did, and those who tried often came back with wild stories of strange noises and shadows that moved against the wind. The road narrowed as he approached Wallace's property, the asphalt giving way to gravel that crunched under the car's tires. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the gnarled trunks of ancient trees that seemed to lean in, as if trying to listen to some secret conversation. Wallace's house came into view, a small, weather-beaten structure that had stood against countless Montana winters. As James pulled up, he saw the old man standing on his porch, shotgun in hand, eyes fixed on the tree line. "Evening, Wallace," James called out as he stepped from the car. "Dispatch said you saw something." Wallace Gibson was a Vietnam veteran, a man who had seen horrors that most in Harlan couldn't imagine. But tonight his face was pale, his hands shaking as he gripped the shotgun. "James," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something out there, something big." James approached the porch, his hand resting casually on his holstered sidearm. "Big like a bear? We've had a few come down from the mountains lately looking for food before hibernation." Wallace shook his head vehemently. "No, not a bear. This was different. Had too many legs, James. Moving all wrong like it was hurt, but Jesus, it was fast when it wanted to be." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He'd known Wallace for decades, had seen him stand tall in the face of bar brawls and forest fires. To see him this shaken was unsettling. "Where did you see it, Wallace?" The old man pointed a trembling finger towards a dense patch of forest about 50 yards from his back door. "Over there. It was dragging itself along, leaving a trail. But James, be careful. This ain't like anything we've dealt with before." James nodded, unclipping his flashlight from his belt. "I'll take a look. You stay here, keep an eye out. If you see anything at all, you fire that shotgun, understand?" Wallace nodded, his grip tightening on the weapon as James made his way towards the tree line. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and sick, like spoiled meat left out in the sun. As he reached the edge of the forest, James saw the first sign that something was amiss. A trail of broken branches and torn leaves led deeper into the woods, accompanied by a smear of dark, wet earth. It looked as if something heavy had been dragged through the undergrowth. James followed the trail, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears, nearly drowning out the sound of the wind. Then he heard it, a low, wet sound like labored breathing, but wrong somehow, inhuman. James froze, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to call for backup, to do anything but continue forward. But he was a deputy of Harlan County, and this was his job. He took another step, and then another, following the sound deeper into the hollows. The beam of his flashlight caught movement ahead, something massive shifting in the shadows. James felt his breath catch in his throat as the creature came into view. It was huge, easily the size of a moose, but that's where any resemblance to normal wildlife ended. Its body was covered in matted fur, patchy in places, revealing sickly pale skin underneath. Bones jutted out at odd angles, as if its skeleton was trying to escape its flesh. But it was the legs that made James's blood run cold. There were too many of them, long and thin, moving in ways that defied natural locomotion. They reminded him of spider legs, but grotesquely enlarged and powerful. The creature turned its head towards him, and James found himself staring into eyes that were impossibly black, seeming to absorb the light from his flashlight. For a moment everything was still, the wind dying down as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then the creature lunged. James barely had time to draw his weapon before it was upon him. He fired, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the trees. The bullet struck the creature, but it barely seemed to notice, its momentum carrying it forward. One of its limbs struck James, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded in his side as he felt something crack, a rib, maybe two. His flashlight went flying, spinning through the air before disappearing into the underbrush. Disoriented and in pain, James struggled to his feet, firing blindly into the darkness. The muzzle flashes provided brief glimpses of the creature, its form twisting and contorting as it moved, always closer, always just out of reach. James emptied his clip, the last shot striking something vital. The creature let out a sound that was part scream, part roar, a noise that seemed to shake the very air around them. It staggered, its many limbs flailing wildly before it collapsed to the ground. For what felt like an eternity, James stood there, gun still raised, waiting for the creature to move again. But it lay still, black ichor oozing from its wounds, staining the forest floor. With shaking hands, James reloaded his weapon, never taking his eyes off the monstrous form before him. He approached cautiously, kicking the creature to ensure it was truly dead. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain in his side intensified. James placed a hand against his ribs, feeling the warm stickiness of blood seeping through his uniform. He needed to call this in, to get help, but as he looked at the creature, at its impossible form, and the black, empty eyes that even in death seemed to stare into his soul, James knew that nothing in Harlan would ever be the same again. With trembling fingers he reached for his radio, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke. "Dispatch, we're going to need backup out here, and call the state authorities. We've got a situation." As he waited for help to arrive, James Garcia, deputy of Harlan County, stood guard over a monster that shouldn't exist, in a forest that suddenly felt far older and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the sound of sirens in the distance, but underneath that, barely audible, was something else, a whisper, a promise, that this was only the beginning. The next morning dawned cold and gray over Harlan. James Garcia sat in the small office of Sheriff Dawson, his ribs tightly bandaged beneath his shirt. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, but the pain in his side and the haunted look in Wallace Gibson's eyes were all too real. Sheriff Dawson, a stocky man with a permanent furrow between his brows, paced behind his desk. "So let me get this straight, James. You're telling me you shot and killed some kind of, what, monster?" James leaned forward, wincing at the movement. "I know how it sounds, Tom, but I saw it with my own eyes. Wallace saw it too. It wasn't any animal I've ever seen before." Dawson sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "And now the state boys have swooped in and taken the body. Convenient, isn't it?" There was a knock at the door, and Deputy Larson poked her head in. "Sheriff, the guys from Fish and Wildlife are here. They want to talk to Deputy Garcia." James felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been dreading this moment since he'd watched state troopers load the creature's body into an unmarked van in the early hours of the morning. Two men entered the office, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to the worn furniture and outdated decor. The taller of the two, a lean man with close-cropped gray hair, stepped forward. "Deputy Garcia, I'm Agent Harding. This is Agent Cole. We'd like to ask you a few questions about last night's incident." The questioning lasted for hours. James recounted every detail, from the moment he received Wallace's call to the final, desperate struggle with the creature. The agents listened impassively, occasionally exchanging glances that James couldn't decipher. "And you're certain it wasn't a bear, or perhaps a mountain lion?" Agent Cole asked, his pen poised over a notepad. James shook his head emphatically. "No, sir. I've lived in these parts my whole life. I know what bears and mountain lions look like. This was something else entirely." Agent Harding leaned forward, his voice low. "Deputy Garcia, I hope you understand the sensitivity of this situation. It's important that we contain any speculation about what happened last night." James felt a surge of anger. "Are you asking me to lie?" "Not at all," Harding replied smoothly. "We're simply asking for discretion, for the good of the town, you understand." As the agents left, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than a simple animal attack. The way they had dismissed his account, the speed with which they had removed the creature's body. It all pointed to something bigger, something they were trying to hide. In the days that followed, an uneasy quiet settled over Harlan. The official story, that a large, possibly rabid bear had been shot and killed, did little to quell the rumors that spread like wildfire through the town. James found himself at the center of it all. People would fall silent when he entered McCabe's tavern, only to burst into frenzied whispers as soon as he left. Some treated him like a hero, while others eyed him with suspicion, as if he were somehow responsible for bringing trouble to their quiet town. Wallace Gibson had become a virtual recluse, refusing to leave his house or speak to anyone about what he had seen. James visited him regularly, partly out of concern, and partly because Wallace was the only other person who knew the truth. "They're out there, James," Wallace said one evening, his eyes fixed on the tree line beyond his property. "I can feel them watching, waiting." James followed his gaze, seeing nothing but shadows and swaying branches, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Wallace was right. Something had changed in Harlan, and the hollows seemed darker, more menacing than ever before. As autumn deepened into winter, strange reports began to trickle in. Livestock gone missing, their pens found torn apart. Hunters speaking of eerie noises echoing through the forests, and always the feeling of being watched. James did his best to investigate each incident, but there was never any concrete evidence. Just broken fences, strange tracks that disappeared into nothing, and the growing fear that gripped the town. It was a bitterly cold night in December when everything came to a head. James was on patrol, his cruiser creeping along the icy roads that skirted the edge of the hollows. The radio crackled to life, dispatch's voice tight with panic. "All units, we have multiple reports of disturbances near the old Miller farm, possible animal attack." James's heart raced as he flipped on his siren and sped towards the farm. He knew the place well, an abandoned property that butted up against the hollows. As he neared, he saw other patrol cars converging on the scene, their lights painting the snow-covered ground in flashes of red and blue. The sight that greeted him would haunt him for years to come. The old barn had been torn apart, its walls splattered with blood, and there, in the trampled snow, were tracks, dozens of them, leading in all directions. Tracks that looked disturbingly similar to those he had seen on that fateful night in October. "My God," Sheriff Dawson breathed, coming to stand beside James. "What did this—" Before James could respond, a scream pierced the night high, terrified, and abruptly cut short. It had come from the direction of the hollows. What followed was chaos. Deputies scrambled to form a perimeter, calling frantically for backup. James found himself moving towards the tree line, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain. As he entered the forest, the world seemed to shift around him. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. And there, in the shadows between them, he saw movement, swift, unnatural, and terrifyingly familiar. They came in a wave, creatures like the one he had killed, but also others, different in form, but all bearing the same otherworldly wrongness. James fired his weapon until it clicked empty, then kept running, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He burst into a clearing and skidded to a halt. Before him stood a scene from a nightmare. A group of the creatures surrounded what looked like a pulsing organic portal, a tear in the very fabric of reality. Through it, James caught glimpses of a world that should not be, a place of twisted landscapes and impossible geometries. In that moment, James Garcia understood. The hollows had always been more than just a forest. It was a threshold, a weak point between worlds. And now something had forced that door wide open. A voice called out behind him, Sheriff Dawson, leading a group of deputies into the clearing. The creatures turned, their attention divided between the newcomers and their portal. James made a split-second decision. He charged towards the portal, his mind racing. If this was the source, then maybe, just maybe, he could end it. "James, no!" Dawson's shout was lost in the cacophony of gunfire and inhuman shrieks. James reached the portal, feeling its energy pulsing against his skin. Without hesitation, he plunged his hands into its swirling depths. Pain unlike anything he had ever known coursed through him, but he held on, gritting his teeth against the agony. He could feel the portal resisting, trying to stay open, but he pushed harder. In his mind he saw Harlan, the town he had sworn to protect, the people who depended on him. With a final desperate surge of will, he pulled. The portal collapsed in on itself with a sound like reality tearing apart. A shockwave of energy blasted outward, knocking everyone, human and creature alike, to the ground. When the dust settled, the clearing was silent. The creatures lay motionless, their forms already beginning to dissolve into nothingness. Of the portal there was no sign. James Garcia lay on his back, staring up at the stars peeking through the canopy above. He could hear the voices of his fellow deputies calling out to each other in confusion and relief. Beside him, Sheriff Dawson knelt, his face a mask of concern. James, can you hear me?" James tried to speak, but no words came. He felt different, changed in ways he couldn't begin to understand. But as he looked into Dawson's eyes, he managed a small nod. It was over. Whatever door had been opened was now closed, sealed by a sacrifice he was only beginning to comprehend. In the years that followed, Harlan slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such events. The official story spoke of a mass animal attack, with no mention of otherworldly creatures or portals to other dimensions. But the people of Harlan knew better. They spoke in hushed tones of the night the hollows came alive, and of the deputy who had saved them all. James Garcia never fully recovered from his encounter with the portal. He retired from the force but remained a fixture in the town, always watching the tree line with knowing eyes. And sometimes, on nights when the wind blew just right, carrying with it the scent of pine and secrets, the people of Harlan would lock their doors, draw their curtains, and pretend they didn't hear the whispers from the hollows, whispers that spoke of other worlds, and the thin barriers that separated them from our own. For they knew that while the door was closed, it was not forgotten. And in Harlan, Montana, the wind would always carry stories, some too terrible to believe and others too true to deny.